Tonight, we journey back to the winter of 1892, a time when the snow fell endlessly and the flickering lamps of small towns across the countryside refused to die, burning all through the coldest nights. This is Christmas 1892, the winter, the lamps burned all night. A story of light that would not fade, of families who clung to hope when the frost seemed to conquer every street, and of one village whose warmth came not from fire, but from the hearts of its people. Before we begin, I want to welcome everyone watching. Whether you're listening from the United States, from Europe, from the quiet corners of Asia, or anywhere else across the world. Where are you joining us from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments below. I always love to see how far our fireside reaches across the world. As you settle in, I invite you to take a deep breath. Let the tension of your day begin to melt away. Maybe you have a blanket nearby, a warm drink beside you, or the soft hum of winter wind outside your window. Turn down the lights, relax your shoulders, and let yourself drift gently into the rhythm of this story. Now, let's return to the snowy lanes of Christmas 1892, where the lamps glowed brighter than ever before. The storm began without warning, like a whisper that grew into a roar. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and fine flakes danced through the air, spiraling down to meet the frozen earth. The villagers of Harrows Hollow thought it would pass by morning. Just another winter snowfall, gentle and brief. But by midnight, the world was gone beneath a white silence so deep that even the church bell seemed muffled. Along the main street, lamps burned in every window. Pale amber light pooled on the frost-bitten panes, glowing faintly against the snow that pressed close from the outside. Inside the homes, families gathered by the fire, speaking in low voices, their words mingling with the soft hiss of burning logs. Mothers tucked their children close, whispering that it would be all right. Fathers checked the lantern oil, tightening wicks, ensuring no flame would falter in the night. Outside, the wind began to sing, a long, mournful hum that wound through chimney tops and rattled at the eaves. Yet for every gust that howled, the lamps burned on. Their steady flames became sentinels in the night, watching over a town wrapped in snow and fear. And somewhere, beyond the far hill, a traveler walked alone, a small figure against a white wilderness, carrying a lantern whose glow wavered but never went out. The traveler's name was Elias Wren, a man known in the nearby villages for his quiet kindness and the way he always carried light wherever he went. On that terrible night of 1892, Elias trudged through the drifts, his boots sinking deep into the frozen whiteness. Each breath formed a cloud before his face, vanishing into the darkness. The snow fell in thick, tumbling curtains now. Not soft anymore, but heavy and relentless, as if the sky itself was collapsing under the weight of winter. His gloved hand clutched the handle of his lantern, and its golden glow swayed with his every step. Inside the small glass chamber, the flame struggled against the icy wind that clawed at it, but Elias had trimmed the wick just right. The flame bent and flickered, yet refused to die. It was all he had, in that fragile, trembling light, and he guarded it as if it were a living thing. The sound of the storm was strange that night. It wasn't only the whistling wind or the groan of snow-laden trees. It carried faint echoes, something like voices, distant and overlapping. Elias paused, listening. Was it just the wind speaking through hollow branches, or something older, something forgotten, whispering through the snow? He couldn't tell, but he felt it. The weight of the night pressing in on him, the endless white stretching in all directions. It was a world erased, where time no longer moved. His coat was rimmed with frost. The fur of his collar had stiffened, his eyelashes dusted in white. Yet beneath the thick layers, his chest burned with warmth, not from the cold, but from determination. He had promised the vicar of Harrows Hollow that he would bring the oil from the northern farmstead before the storm worsened. Without it, the lamps in the church and along the streets would fade before dawn. And so he walked through snow that reached his knees, carrying a satchel of oil tins tied tightly with rope. Each one clinked softly with his movement, a fragile sound swallowed by the vast quiet. When he looked up, he could just make out the faint glow of Harrows Hollow far in the distance, dim and golden through the white gloom. It seemed impossibly far away, like a star behind a curtain. Yet he smiled faintly beneath his scarf. He would reach it. He must. Above him the storm deepened, the sky swirling like ash. The snow was no longer falling. It was rising, lifting from the ground in spiraling waves that blurred the line between earth and sky. Elias leaned forward, bracing against the gale, his lantern pressed close to his chest. The glass had begun to frost over, muting the light. He wiped it clean with his mitten, revealing the flame. Still alive, still burning. For a moment, he stopped to rest beside a frost-covered fence. The wood was hard as stone beneath his glove, and the wind howled through its gaps like a pipe organ's mournful tune. He thought of the village children, their faces pressed to frosted windows, watching for him. He imagined them whispering, "He'll come soon, the lights won't go out." That thought, that fragile faith, warmed him better than any fire. He closed his eyes briefly and listened to the storm's voice. Somewhere deep within the wind's cry, he thought he heard the toll of the church bell, faint and far away. 1, 2, 3. He counted each strike like a heartbeat. He was not lost. Not yet. And so Elias rose again, lantern raised high, his figure vanishing into the whirling storm. A single, moving flame in an ocean of white. In the heart of Harrows Hollow, the night stretched endlessly. Snow pressed against every window, and the sound of the wind had become a constant murmur, a voice that filled every silence between heartbeats. The villagers had gathered in the town square hours earlier, before the storm swallowed the streets, to discuss what they feared most. The lamps were running low on oil. Those lamps were not mere decorations. In a winter like this, they were lifelines, small suns in a frozen world. The townsfolk believed that as long as the lamps burned, warmth and hope would remain within their walls. It was an old superstition, whispered from one Christmas to the next, but no one dared to test it. Now, in the parlour of the vicarage, several families huddled close. The fire crackled low, its orange embers pulsing softly, while frost crept along the window panes like white lace. The vicar, Father Alcott, sat near the hearth, rubbing his hands together as he stared into the flames. His mind was not on the fire, but on the man still out there, Elias Wren, walking through the storm with the last of the oil. Beside him, Mrs. Alcott poured tea from a small pot that had long gone lukewarm. The faint scent of chamomile lingered in the air, soft and earthy. She spoke gently, as if afraid that her words might disturb the thin thread of calm that kept the room together. "He'll make it," she said. "Elias always does." Father Alcott nodded, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "The snow is heavier than I've seen in 20 years. If it deepens, the roads will be gone by dawn." In the corner, a group of children sat together, wrapped in wool blankets. They played with candle shadows against the wall, tiny hand puppets flickering in the dim light. A little girl named Clara whispered, "When he comes back, can we see him light the lamps again?" Her older brother smiled faintly. if he gets here before the storm ends. Outside, the lamps along the street sputtered. Their light shimmered weakly through the veil of snow, glowing like tiny golden halos in the white darkness. Every window that faced the street showed the same picture: faces pressed close to glass, eyes searching for movement beyond the storm. The air inside the homes was scented with wax and wood smoke. Bread dough sat rising near fireplaces, forgotten in the warmth. The people of Harrows Hollow were waiting, not just for Elias, but for reassurance, for proof that no night, however long, could truly take their light away. At the edge of town, an old man named Thomas Greer stood watch beside the last working street lamp. He was the lamplighter, his hands trembling with age, his breath visible in the cold. He had tended those flames for nearly 50 winters, and tonight he refused to leave them. He whispered to the glass of the lamp, "Stay with me now, just until he returns." He touched the post lightly, feeling its chill, and peered into the storm. Somewhere beyond, he knew Elias was fighting his way home. And until the first glimmer of that lantern appeared through the snow, Thomas would not move an inch. Inside the church, the great oil lamp that hung from the ceiling flickered weakly. Its flame bowed low, swaying with every breath of wind that seeped through the cracks in the wood. The choir benches were empty, the hymn books closed, yet still the silence inside felt sacred. And as the bell tower creaked above the drifting snow, the villagers of Harrows Hollow waited for light, for warmth, for the man who carried both. The road that led to Harrows Hollow was no longer a road at all. It had become a pale ribbon of uncertainty, buried beneath drifts that twisted like dunes beneath the swirling wind. The fences that once marked the boundaries of fields had vanished entirely, leaving only faint humps of snow to hint at where they stood. Every sound was softened. Even the crunch of Elias Wren's boots seemed muted, swallowed whole by the vastness of the storm. He leaned forward, his shoulders bowed, the lantern clutched close to his chest as though it were his own beating heart. Each step was a struggle. The snow reached nearly to his thighs now, and the weight of his satchel pressed painfully across his back. His breath came ragged, and frost clung to the wool of his scarf. He could no longer see more than a few feet ahead. The world was a blur of white and wind. But he pressed on, his mind fixed on one image, the glow of Harrows Hollow, the lamps burning in the windows, and the faces of children waiting behind glass. The wind tore at his cloak, flinging snow like shards of glass. It stung his cheeks, seeped through his boots, and numbed his fingers until he could barely feel the lantern handle. Still he didn't stop. Every few steps he whispered something under his breath, not words of complaint, but a quiet prayer. "Keep the flame. Keep the flame." The rhythm of the phrase helped him keep pace. Step by step, breath by breath, he walked. After some time, though he could not tell how long, he saw something dark beneath the snow. He bent down and brushed it aside with his mitten. It was a milestone, its carved numbers nearly worn away by age. He traced the faint letters with his gloved fingers. Harrows Hollow. 2 miles. Only 2 miles left, but 2 miles in a storm like this could feel like forever. He pushed onward. The land began to dip, sloping into a shallow valley. Here the snow had gathered in great, uneven mounds. In places it rose so high that Elias had to crawl across the top, using his elbows to keep from sinking. His lantern swung beneath him, its light spilling through the snow like sunlight through ice. At one point, the wind lulled for just a moment, the first silence he'd heard all night. In that stillness, Elias could hear the faintest sound, running water. He realized he was near the old brook, the one that wound down from the hills. It wasn't frozen solid yet, which meant he was close to the lower path leading to the bridge. But when he reached it, he saw that the bridge was gone. The wooden planks had collapsed under the weight of the snow and ice, leaving a black gap in the whiteness below. He crouched on the bank, staring across the narrow gorge. The stream beneath moved sluggishly, dark as ink, rimmed with ice. For a moment he simply stood there, snow piling on his shoulders, the flame trembling inside the lantern glass. Then he tightened his grip, lowered himself carefully, and began to cross. The ice groaned beneath his boots, a low, terrible sound, like something alive. He spread his weight, moving slowly, each step deliberate. The current moved just beneath the frozen surface, swirling like smoke. His reflection wavered in the faint light, ghostly and thin. Halfway across, the ice cracked. He froze, holding his breath. The crack widened, spidering across the surface beneath his boots. For a second, the world seemed to tilt. Then, mercifully, the sound stopped. He exhaled shakily and stepped again. When he reached the far bank, he sank to his knees, gripping the snow-covered earth with trembling hands. His lantern light cast a golden halo around him, touching the frost-covered reeds, the faint shimmer of water below, and the path beyond. He had made it across. As he stood again, brushing snow from his coat, the first true fear of the night passed from him, replaced by something else. A strange, quiet resolve. He whispered again to the flame, almost like a companion. Only a little further now, just a little further. And so he went on, following the ghostly outline of the road beneath the snow, toward the lights that waited for him in the heart of Harrows Hollow. In the center of Harrows Hollow, the old church of St. Bridget stood like a guardian in the snow. Its steeple rose above the town, half lost in the white haze that drifted through the night air. The church was more than a place of prayer. It was a sanctuary, a keeper of warmth and faith when the world outside turned cold and uncertain. Inside, the air was faintly scented with melted wax and evergreen boughs. A few candles flickered before the altar, their flames bending gently in the draught that crept through the ancient stone walls. The pews were filled with townsfolk wrapped in shawls and coats, their faces pale in the golden half-light. The belfry lamp, a large iron lantern that had burned above the church for as long as anyone could remember, was guttering low. The oil had nearly run dry. Each flicker cast long shadows up the pillars, like fingers reaching toward heaven. Father Alcott climbed the narrow staircase to the bell tower, his boots echoing softly on the worn wooden steps. The sound was hollow and lonely in the vast silence of the storm outside. When he reached the top, the cold air rushed in through the open slats, biting at his face. He looked out over the snow-covered town. The lamps along the streets were dimming one by one, their flames shrinking behind layers of frost. Only a few still burned brightly. The lamplighter, Thomas's post, among them. The old man stood motionless beside it, a dark silhouette in the storm, his coat flapping like a flag in the wind. Father Alcott pressed a hand against the lantern glass in the tower. It was warm, but fading. He whispered softly, "Hold on, Elias. Just a little longer." From the tower's height, he could see the great white plain stretching out beyond the edge of town. Nothing moved, no light, no sign of the man they waited for. Below, the villagers prayed in murmurs. The church organ, cold and silent, stood in the corner beneath a cover of dust. The hymn books lay unopened on the front pew, but every so often someone began to hum a carol under their breath. Silent Night, or The First Noel, their voices trembling like the flames of the candles that lined the aisle. Snow pressed against the windows, sealing the world outside. The wind wailed through the eaves, a ghostly chorus that rose and fell like the sea. Then a small boy ran up the aisle to the altar. His name was Jonas Bell, the blacksmith's son. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his mittens damp with melted snow. He tugged at Father Alcott's coat and whispered, "Father, I saw something, out by the ridge." The vicar crouched down, his heart quickening. "What did you see, child?" Jonas pointed toward the window where the storm swirled thick and white. "A light," he said. "It's far off, but it's moving." Father Alcott turned, peering through the frosted glass. For a moment, he saw nothing but the storm. Then, faintly, just at the edge of the hill, a flicker, a trembling golden glow. "Elias," he whispered. The boy nodded, his eyes wide. "It's him, isn't it?" The vicar smiled faintly, his face weary but hopeful. "Yes, Jonas, it must be." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the storm's howl. "He's coming," he said. "The light still burns." A murmur rippled through the church. Faces lifted, shoulders straightened. The faint hum of hymns grew stronger, warmer, as though the news itself had rekindled every heart in the room. Above them, the great bell in the tower swayed once, groaning in its cradle. It didn't ring. It only sighed, like a giant waking from sleep. But that single sound was enough. For the first time that night, the people of Harrows Hollow believed that the dawn might come after all. And far beyond the ridge, through the storm and snow, a single lantern still moved steadily through the dark. The wind softened as Elias descended into the pinewood valley. The storm still swirled above, but the tall evergreens shielded the ground like a green cathedral roof, catching the brunt of the snow in their branches. The air here was quieter, filled with the muffled sighs of falling flakes and the creak of trees bending beneath their icy crowns. Elias paused at the forest's edge, breath heaving in great plumes of steam. The lantern light shimmered across the frost-coated trunks, turning them to pillars of gold. He leaned against one, his fingers trembling from exhaustion, and listened. Beneath the whisper of the pines, he could hear a low, steady hum, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the stillness. He was tired. Every muscle in his body ached from the long push through the storm. His boots were soaked, his legs stiff, and his back burned from the weight of the satchel full of oil. Yet still he moved, step by slow step, along the narrow path that wound like a ribbon through the trees. The snow beneath his boots gave a soft, almost musical crunch. It was a strangely soothing sound, steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. The lantern swayed with each motion, casting small arcs of amber light on the path ahead. Occasionally, a gust of wind would shake loose a shower of snow from the branches above, landing on his shoulders in soft, cold bursts. There was something deeply peaceful about the forest despite the cold. The scent of pine resin hung in the air, sharp, clean, alive. It mingled with the faint metallic tang of frost, and Elias breathed it in slowly, letting it calm him. The storm beyond the trees seemed like a different world now, distant and unreal. Here, in this frozen silence, he could almost believe the world had stopped turning altogether. After a while, he came upon a fallen tree, its trunk split by age and heavy snow. It blocked the path, forcing him to climb. As he hoisted himself over, his lantern slipped, swinging dangerously in the air. The flame flickered, nearly dying out. Elias froze, his heart lurching, and cupped the glass with his mittened hands until it steadied again. He whispered, voice rough with fatigue, "No, not yet. Stay with me. They need you still." And the flame, as if it heard him, steadied into a calm, unwavering glow. Beyond the fallen tree, the forest deepened. The path narrowed to a thin corridor between towering trunks. The moonlight, what little there was, filtered down through gaps in the canopy, striking the snow in faint silver patches. The air grew colder, sharper, and Elias could feel frost forming on the inside of his coat collar. Then he saw it, something faint through the trees ahead. At first he thought it was another reflection of his own lantern, but as he drew closer he realized it was another light, low and golden, moving slowly between the trees. He stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied. It was smaller than his own flame, and it moved as if carried by a trembling hand. Elias hesitated for a long moment, then called out softly, his voice nearly lost in the hush. "Hello? Is someone there?" The only answer was the sigh of wind through the branches. Still he felt it. He wasn't alone. As he stepped forward, the strange light withdrew, slipping deeper into the forest. Elias followed, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The air around him seemed to grow warmer, the scent of pine stronger. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard faint singing like the echo of a lullaby carried by the wind. He followed the glow through the maze of trees until at last he reached a small clearing. The snow there was untouched, smooth as silk, and in the center stood an old wooden shrine, half buried by drifts. Its lantern burned faintly within, a sacred flame left by travelers long ago. Elias knelt before it, brushing snow from its base. The wood was carved with the image of a winged woman, Saint Bridget herself, the patron of the village. Her carved eyes seemed to gaze upon him through the frost, calm and knowing. He bowed his head, murmuring a prayer of thanks. The flame inside the shrine flickered once, sending a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the air. For a moment, Elias felt warmth, true warmth, spread through his chest. Then he stood, shoulders squared once more, and pressed on toward Harrows Hollow, where the people waited and the lamps still fought against the dark. While Elias moved through the pinewood valley, a smaller drama unfolded on the northern edge of Harrows Hollow, in a small, crooked house by the frozen river. Inside lived widow Miriam Gray, a quiet woman with silver hair tied in a dark ribbon, and a voice soft as snowfall. She had lived alone since her husband's passing 3 winters before, surviving on memories, knitting by candlelight, and tending the single rosebush that refused to die in her frosted window box. That night her cottage was nearly buried. Snow had climbed to her windowsills and the roof groaned under its weight. Yet inside, her parlour glowed with a faint, amber warmth. A single candle stood on the table beside her, burning steadily despite the draughts that whispered through the cracks in the old wood. The candle had been a gift from her late husband, a merchant who'd once brought home fine goods from London, spices, cloth, and once this tall beeswax candle wrapped in crimson silk. "It will burn long," he'd told her, smiling. "Long enough to see you through the darkest night." Tonight, she needed it more than ever. The wind howled beyond her door, battering the shutters until they rattled like loose bones. The sound of the storm was almost alive, a wailing, restless spirit moving through the hollow. But Miriam sat calmly by the fire, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm to the gusts. Every so often she would glance at the candle flame. It wavered, but did not bow. A knock came suddenly at the door, not a harsh pounding, but a faint, deliberate tap-tap, like the polite greeting of someone hesitant to disturb. Miriam froze. No one should have been out in weather like this. For a moment, She thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then it came again. Tap, tap. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply, only the sound of the storm's breathing. Then faintly, she heard a man's voice, rough, distant. "Please, a moment's shelter." Miriam hesitated only a second before unlatching the door. The wind rushed in first, wild and cold, carrying with it a flurry of snow that scattered across her rug. And behind it stood a young man, pale and shivering, his cloak crusted with frost. His eyes were bright, though weary, and in his gloved hand he held a small, glass-covered lantern. "Forgive me," he gasped. "I'm heading for the village. I needed a moment to rest." Miriam stepped aside quickly. "Come in, dear, quickly before you freeze." He entered, closing the door behind him. The warmth of the fire washed over his face, and he exhaled a sigh that trembled like relief. He set the lantern carefully on her table beside the candle. For a brief moment, the two flames glowed together, the steady, patient candle and the flickering traveller's light. And Miriam thought how strange it was that such small things could make a whole room feel safe. "You're headed for Harrows Hollow?" she asked softly. He nodded, wiping melted snow from his brow. "Yes, the lamps are dying. I've oil from the farm to keep them burning." Miriam's eyes softened with understanding. "Ah, you're the one they call Elias Wren." He looked surprised. "You know my name?" "Everyone knows your name on a night like this." She smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "Sit a moment. Warm your hands." He did, stretching them toward the fire. The scent of pine smoke and beeswax filled the air. Outside, the wind moaned low, circling the cottage like a restless creature. Miriam poured a little broth into a bowl from the pot hanging above the flames. "Eat," she said gently. "A light burns longer when the heart behind it has strength." Elias smiled gratefully. "You sound like my grandmother." "I sound like an old woman who's seen too many winters," she said, with a laugh that was half sigh. As he ate, his eyes drifted to her candle. It burned tall, unwavering, though the draught from the chimney should have made it dance. There was something steady, almost sacred, in its glow. "That's a strong flame," he murmured. Miriam nodded. "It's burned every Christmas since the night I lost my husband. I light it to remind myself that love doesn't end when the body fades. It changes shape, becomes warmth, or light, or memory." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Then perhaps all our lamps are like that, reminders of what we're still holding on to." The widow smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then go, Elias. Carry that warmth with you. I'll keep this candle burning until you reach them." He stood, refastened his cloak, and took up his lantern. As he opened the door, the cold rushed in again, fierce and alive, but this time it felt weaker, as if even the storm bowed before the two flames that now burned behind him. As he stepped into the snow, he glanced back once. Through the storm, he could see her window glowing, the widow's candle, standing firm against the night. And for the first time in hours, Elias felt the weight of the storm lessen just a little. Elias followed the river south, guided by the sound of its slow, muffled current moving beneath sheets of ice. The water's voice was strange in the stillness, a whispering murmur that echoed off the snowy banks, as if the river itself remembered warmer days and was softly mourning their loss. The light from his lantern fell in narrow ribbons across the frost, glinting faintly on the frozen ripples that looked like glass waves captured mid-motion. The night was growing colder, the kind of cold that doesn't simply bite at the skin, but sinks deep into the bones, hollowing out every breath. Elias felt his fingers stiffen around the lantern's handle, his joints aching with each movement. But in his mind, he could still see Widow Miriam's candle. Tall, serene, unwavering. That image kept him upright, step after slow step, through the endless white. After an hour of walking, he came to the old stone bridge that crossed the lower bend of the river, a relic from before the village was built. It arched gracefully over the water, its stones slick with frost and draped in snow. Beneath it, the river moaned softly, pressing against the ice as if longing to break free. Elias paused at the bridge's foot, lifting his lantern higher. The light painted the stones in a soft amber hue, revealing cracks that spidered across the surface like veins of time. A faint mist hung over the water below, glowing faintly gold in the lantern's reach. He remembered the stories told in Harrows Hollow, that this bridge was once called the Bridge of Echoes, where travellers could hear their own hearts reflected in the whisper of the wind. Some said the bridge held memories of everyone who had ever crossed it, their hopes and fears caught in the stones like breath trapped in glass. Elias smiled faintly to himself. "Then remember me kindly," he murmured. He took his first step onto the bridge. The stone groaned beneath his boot, a long, low creak that sent a chill up his spine. Snow slid down from the arch above, landing in powdery heaps near his feet. He moved carefully, the lantern swaying with each cautious motion. Midway across, he stopped. There, faint but clear, came the echo of footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, raising the lantern high. The light spilled across the bridge's length, but the path behind him was empty. Nothing but the swirl of falling snow and the whisper of wind moving through the arches. Still, the sound came again. Footsteps, soft and measured, matching his own. Elias's breath quickened. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking in the cold. Silence. Then faintly, the sound of laughter, not cruel, not mocking, soft, like a child's giggle heard from another room. He stood still, listening. The lantern's flame flickered in rhythm with his heartbeat. And then, through the veil of snow, he saw it, a faint shimmer of light at the far end of the bridge. It wasn't white like the snow or gold like his lantern. It was blue, soft, ethereal, like moonlight caught in mist. He stepped closer, squinting. The shape that emerged was small, almost human, though blurred by the flurries. It moved slowly, drifting more than walking, the way fog curls through the morning air. Elias froze. He had heard tales of spirits said to linger near the bridge, the souls of travellers who lost their way long ago, who waited for warmth that never came. Yet he felt no fear. The light did not seem threatening. It pulsed gently in time with the beating of his heart, as though it were breathing alongside him. He whispered, almost reverently, "You're not lost, are you?" The light hovered for a moment, then began to move again, crossing the bridge ahead of him, steady and sure. Elias followed, his boots echoing softly against the stones. As he reached the far side, the light paused once more. For a fleeting instant he thought he saw the outline of a woman, her features soft, her expression calm, her form shimmering like ice under moonlight. And then, as the wind shifted, she was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth in the air. The echoing footsteps ceased. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath forming clouds that drifted away like ghosts. "Thank you," he whispered into the night. Whether the spirit heard him or not, he could not say. But something in him felt lighter, as though part of the storm had passed through him and gone on its way. He turned back once, looking across the bridge. The snow had already covered his footprints, leaving no trace of his passage. Only the river remained, whispering softly beneath the ice. Lifting his lantern high, Elias continued toward the hill that would lead him home, his path marked not by road or stars, but by faith and flame. The climb from the river valley was slow and unforgiving. Each step forward seemed to erase itself beneath new snow before Elias could take another. The world had become a swirl of white and shadow, sky and ground blending into one endless storm. The lantern's golden glow carved only a small circle of light around him, a fragile world in which he could still exist. Beyond it, the darkness pressed close, heavy and infinite. He walked with his head bent low, the snow stinging his face like 1,000 needles. The wind had changed. It no longer howled but hummed, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It was almost melodic, like a choir singing from beneath the ground. Then faintly he realized what it was. Bells. At first he thought it was the church bell from Harrows Hollow, carried on the wind. But the sound was too close, too near, soft, repeating, almost mournful. It came from below him, beneath the snow-covered hill he was climbing. Elias stopped, breath catching in his throat, and turned his head. The sound came again, a chime, faint and hollow, followed by another. He lowered himself to his knees, brushing snow aside with his gloved hands. The drifts were thick, frozen in layers, but as he dug, a glimmer of metal caught the lantern's light. It was a small iron bell, half buried and swinging gently on a cord. He brushed more snow away and found another beside it, and another. A whole string of them stretched across the hillside, their faint motion stirred by the trembling wind. He recognized them at once. These were the shepherd's bells, once tied between the pastures and the ridge to guide livestock home during fog and storm. They had long been buried and forgotten, their cords entombed in frost, and yet somehow they were ringing tonight. Elias knelt there for a moment, lantern held low, watching them sway. The air around the bells shimmered faintly, each chime sending a tiny echo through the snow like ripples through still water. The sound was beautiful, haunting, delicate, full of memory. He remembered being a boy, standing beside his father in these same hills as the bells rang faintly in summer wind. "Listen close," his father had said. "They remind the lost where home lies." Elias closed his eyes. For the first time that night, he could picture Harrows Hollow clearly. The streets glimmering with frost, the church spire rising above the roofs, and the glow of lamps in every window. The village wasn't far now. He could almost feel its warmth on the wind, faint but steady. He stood slowly, brushing snow from his knees. As he turned to continue, one of the bells gave a sudden, clear note, bright and sharp, like a call. It startled him at first, but then he smiled. It was almost as if the valley itself was urging him onward. He whispered, "Then lead me home, if you will." The bells chimed again, softly, tenderly, and Elias followed their sound through the storm. The path wound upward, steeper with every step. The snow was thinner here, blown aside by the wind. The lantern's light caught glints of ice among the rocks, frozen rivulets that shimmered like tiny mirrors. Above him, the faint outline of the ridge came into view, a ghostly curve against the pale sky. As he neared the top, the bells grew fainter behind him, their song fading into the distance. But even as their music vanished, its rhythm remained in his heart, that slow, steady beat that kept him moving when every part of his body begged for rest. At last, he reached the crest of the hill. The storm was lighter here, the clouds thinning enough for moonlight to break through in silver patches. And there, beyond the valley, Elias saw it, faint, small, but unmistakable. The golden glow of Harrows Hollow, flickering through the snow like a constellation brought to earth. He stopped, breathless. His knees nearly gave out from relief. The lamps were still burning. A laugh escaped his lips, cracked and raw, but full of wonder. The light of the village shimmered through the falling snow, alive and waiting. He pressed a hand to his lantern, whispering softly to the flame within. "Do you see it, little one? We're nearly there." And though the storm still raged behind him, Elias Wren began his final descent toward the Valley of Lights, following the faint toll of bells that sang his way home. Elias began the descent carefully, leaning into the slope as the snow shifted beneath his boots. The hill was steep and slick, the path beneath hidden beneath layers of powder and ice. The lantern swung beside him, its soft golden light cutting narrow shapes through the storm. Below, Harrows Hollow gleamed faintly, a small cluster of golden dots flickering against the vast pale world. The lamps, the ones that must not go out. He exhaled slowly, his breath curling into silver mist that vanished into the cold. His legs trembled from exhaustion. Every step was a test of balance, his soles slipping against the slick crust of snow. The wind roared around him again, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke, the unmistakable breath of the village. The closer he came, the more the glow grew, until the lamps seemed to merge into one living light, pulsing softly in the darkness like a single beating heart. He thought of the people waiting inside their homes, the vicar in his tower, the lamplighter by his post, the children pressing their faces to frozen windows, searching the white for a sign of him. He imagined their whispered prayers, their trembling hands, keeping small flames alive with what little oil remained. That vision steadied him more than the firmest ground ever could. As he descended, he passed through a stand of birch trees, their slender trunks rising like pale columns in the night. The bark peeled in long ribbons that fluttered in the wind, whispering as they moved. The lantern light gave their surfaces a ghostly sheen, and the snow beneath was scattered with fallen branches, delicate, brittle, gleaming faintly with frost. He paused to rest at the base of one tree, his back pressing against its cool bark. The wind hissed through the upper branches, carrying with it a faint melody. It wasn't the bells this time, but something softer, a harmony of sound that seemed to weave itself through the air. Perhaps the storm itself was beginning to tire, its anger fading into something gentler. The silence between gusts was immense. In that quiet, Elias became aware of the smallest details, the soft creak of the trees, the faint squeak of his lantern's hinge, the muffled rhythm of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Even the snow seemed to have sound, a crystalline whisper beneath his boots. He began walking again. Each step took him lower, closer to the first fence posts of the village outskirts. Through the storm he could now see the faint silhouette of rooftops, snow-capped and round, their chimneys breathing slow plumes of smoke into the air. The sight filled him with something that felt like gratitude and something deeper still, belonging. Halfway down, the wind shifted suddenly, strong enough to knock him sideways. He fell to one knee, the satchel slamming against his hip. The oil tins clinked sharply, their metal ringing like dull bells in the night. Elias gritted his teeth, pushing himself upright, clutching the lantern close. The flame flickered wildly, nearly snuffed out by the gust, but he cupped his hands around it, whispering through chattering teeth, "Not now!" "Not when we're so close." The flame quivered once, then steadied again, burning with renewed strength. He smiled faintly, though his lips were pale and cracked. "Good. That's it. We'll see them soon enough." The storm was easing now, the snowfall thinning into a gentle drift of white feathers that spiraled lazily through the air. Through the soft haze, Elias could finally see the road leading to the village gate, or what was left of it. The snow had nearly buried the signpost, but the words still glimmered faintly under a crust of ice. "Welcome to Harrows Hollow, light for the lost." He traced the letters with his mittened hand, brushing the frost away. It felt like touching something sacred, a promise etched in wood. As he stepped onto the road, the snow beneath his boots changed texture. Firmer now, packed from where wagons and footsteps had once passed. It was the first true road he'd felt in hours. The lantern light gleamed across the path ahead, showing faint impressions of footprints that had long since filled with snow. He followed them carefully, each step measured, deliberate. And then, faintly at first, he heard it. A new sound, rising above the wind. Voices. They were distant, muted by the storm, but unmistakably human. A soft chorus of song carried on the night air. It was the sound of the villagers singing in the church, their voices joining like threads of light weaving through the dark. Elias stopped, closing his eyes, listening. The melody was familiar. The old carol sung every Christmas Eve, the one his mother used to hum when he was a boy. The words drifted faintly through the snow. "Through frost and fear our hearts shall stay, while lamps of love still light the way." Tears pricked his frozen lashes. The warmth in his chest spread, slow and sure. The people hadn't given up. Their light still burned, in their lamps, in their song, in their hope. He lifted his lantern, holding it high, the glow spilling outward like the rising sun through mist. Ahead, the first lights of the village grew clearer, brighter, beckoning him home. He whispered hoarsely to the night, "Almost there. Just hold on a little longer." And the wind, softer now, seemed to answer with a sigh, as if even the storm was at peace with that truth. At the far end of Harrows Hollow, beside the main crossroads where the snow drifted highest, Thomas Greer, the old lamplighter, still kept his vigil. His back was bent, his eyes tired, but his spirit unbroken. He had not left his post since the storm began. Even when the wind screamed and the cold burned through his coat, the last lamp he had tended stood beside him, its flame trembling but alive, the glass nearly opaque with frost. He leaned upon his cane, breath misting in the air, muttering softly to the post as though it were an old friend. "Easy now, just a bit longer. Elias will come." The wind tugged at his words, carrying them off into the dark. He shivered, pulling his wool scarf higher over his mouth. Around him, the world was silent, except for the low sigh of falling snow. The houses nearby were all shuttered tight, their windows glowing faintly behind curtains. Small pockets of warmth scattered through the deep blue night. Thomas's hands were stiff and red from the cold. He rubbed them together before holding them close to the glass of the lamp. Inside, the flame fluttered weakly, a faint pulse of light fighting against the frost that thickened with every breath of wind. He knew it would not last much longer, not without oil. He glanced toward the ridge beyond the village, where the storm still moved in great, pale sheets. His eyes narrowed, the old instinct of a lamplighter, trained to spot a glimmer even through the fiercest fog, stirring awake. Somewhere beyond that snow he thought he saw it, a faint glow moving slowly between the hills. "Ah," he whispered, his lips cracking with a smile. "There you are." He straightened as best he could, brushing snow from his coat. "Come on, lad, let's see what light you've kept alive out there." The snow shifted around him in whispering waves. He took a few steps toward the ridge, his cane sinking deep with every move. Each breath he drew felt like inhaling glass, yet the sight of that distant, swaying glow filled him with a warmth that no fire could match. Behind him, the lamp sputtered. The wick was low, the oil nearly gone. Its flame dipped and flared, casting faint shadows that danced along the snow-covered fence posts. Thomas turned back, his expression softening. "Don't you dare go out now," he murmured. "He's nearly here." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the smallest vial of oil he had left, his reserve for emergencies. His hands shook as he unscrewed the cap and poured the last drops into the lamp. The liquid gleamed faintly before vanishing into the wick. Slowly, the flame brightened, blooming with renewed strength. "There we go," he said softly, voice trembling. "Just a bit longer, eh?" The wind carried a distant sound to him, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, crunching through the snow, slow and uneven. He turned again, peering through the swirling white, and there, faint but real, he saw a figure descending the hill. A small lantern swayed from the traveller's hand, its glow warm and alive. Thomas's throat tightened. He blinked hard, his eyes wet not from cold, but from sudden, overwhelming relief. "Elias," he whispered. "You mad, blessed fool, you made it." He shuffled forward, waving his cane weakly in the air, his voice cracking against the wind. "Here! Over here, lad! Follow the light!" The figure below lifted his lantern in reply, and for a moment 2 distant glows shone across the snow, calling to each other like stars across the night. Elias quickened his pace, though every step seemed to drag at his legs. His satchel clinked softly at his side. He was close now, close enough to see the outlines of houses, the crooked rooftops, and the leaning lamp-posts that lined the road. And at the very end of that road he saw Thomas, old, stooped, stubborn Thomas, standing beside the last lamp in the village, keeping it alive with the final drops of oil. The sight struck Elias deeply. The man's silhouette, framed by that trembling glow, looked almost eternal, a guardian of light, holding his post against the endless dark. He wanted to call out, to tell him he'd brought enough oil to keep the lamps burning through Christmas and beyond, but his voice caught in his throat. Instead, he lowered his head and pressed forward, the light of his lantern merging gradually with the village's faint, golden haze. Thomas waited, still as a statue, snow piling on his shoulders. His heart thudded with each flicker of approaching light. The boy he'd taught to light lamps so many winters ago, the boy who'd become the hope of the village, was coming home. When Elias finally reached him, breathless and frostbitten, Thomas smiled through cracked lips. "Took you long enough," he rasped. Elias managed a grin despite the exhaustion. "I told you, I'd bring the light back." The old man chuckled, a deep, rasping sound. "Aye, and so you have." As they stood together in the snow, 2 flames burned side by side, one in the lantern, one in the street lamp. Small, steady, defiant. Beyond them, the rest of the lamps waited in silence, each one holding its breath for the oil that would soon bring them back to life. Elias and Thomas stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow, their breath forming silver clouds that mingled in the frigid air. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm had eased to a gentle drift, flakes spiraling slowly like ash from a dying fire. The lantern in Elias's hand and the lamp beside Thomas burned together, 2 golden hearts beating in the darkness. At last, Thomas exhaled and reached out, resting a gloved hand on the younger man's arm. "You've done it, lad," he said softly. "They'll see this light and know the worst is over." Elias nodded, his face pale and wind-burned, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Not yet," he murmured. "There's still work to do." He slipped the satchel from his shoulder and crouched, untying the cords that bound it shut. Inside were 4 metal tins, their sides dented but intact. When he opened the first, the faint scent of lamp oil drifted into the air. Sharp and clean, carrying with it the promise of warmth, Thomas watched, awe softening his weathered face. "Saints bless you, boy. That's enough for every lamp in the hollow." Elias smiled faintly, his lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. "Then let's see them shine again." They moved together down the road, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. The world was silent, except for their breaths and the faint creak of hinges as one by one they lifted the glass covers of the lamps that lined the street. Each flame within flickered low, weak but alive, waiting for renewal. Elias poured oil carefully, the golden liquid gliding smooth as honey, and Thomas trimmed the wicks with his pocket blade. When they lit the first lamp anew, it flared to life with a soft whoomph, its light spilling wide across the snow. The glow touched the walls of the nearest houses, turning their frosted windows into sheets of molten amber. For the first time that night, the shadows retreated. Elias moved to the next, then the next. His fingers were numb, but he worked methodically, his movements sure despite the ache in his body. Each lamp that caught flame seemed to breathe, a slow exhale of light after a long silence. Soon the main street was lined with warmth once more, the golden glow stretching from end to end like a ribbon of fire. From behind shuttered windows, faces began to appear. Curtains parted, and wide, wondering eyes peered out into the night. A child gasped, pointing, "Mama, the lights! They're coming back!" Doors opened, cautious at first, then in wonder. Families stepped into the street, clutching blankets around their shoulders. The snow glittered around them, reflecting the lamplight until it seemed the ground itself glowed. Father Alcott was the first to speak, his voice carrying gently through the still air. "Praise be," he murmured. "He's returned." He walked down the lane, his robes trailing through the snow, until he reached Elias and Thomas. The vicar's eyes were wet with tears, his face lit by the nearest lamp. "You've saved us, my son," he said. "You've kept the promise of Christmas alive." Elias shook his head weakly. "It wasn't just me," he said, voice low. "The lights never truly went out. They were waiting. I just helped them breathe again." The vicar smiled softly, laying a hand on his shoulder. "Even so, your flame guided them. You've done God's quiet work this night." As the lamps continued to flare back to life, the streets transformed. The golden light spilled over fences, rooftops, and church doors, touching the frozen world with warmth. Snow crystals glittered like stars, scattered underfoot. The townsfolk began to sing, softly at first, then stronger, voices weaving together with the hiss of lamps and the hush of snow. The melody rose gently, a living hymn carried by wind and faith alike. Thomas, standing beside Elias, chuckled through his exhaustion. "Listen to that," he said. "You brought back more than light. You brought them hope." Elias looked down the glowing street, his vision blurring from fatigue and emotion. "Hope burns the longest," he whispered. The two men stood together, watching as the lamps blazed brighter, the golden chain of flame stretching all the way to the distant church tower. From its belfry, the great lamp, dim and weary only an hour before, caught the new glow and shone again, casting light across the rooftops of Harrows Hollow. The storm, as if defeated, began to drift away into the distance, leaving behind a deep, peaceful silence. Snow continued to fall, but now It sparkled. By the time Elias and Thomas reached the square, the storm had quieted to a whisper. The air was still, heavy with snow, but warm with the faint hum of human joy. Every lamp in Harrows Hollow burned now, golden, steady, and defiant against the night. Their glow wove through the streets like threads of fire, connecting every window, every heart. At the centre of the square stood the church of St. Brigid, its tall steeple rising into the pale mist. Its great iron lantern, once guttering low, now shimmered anew, strengthened by the light that had returned to the streets below. The stained glass windows glowed softly from within, alive with colour, reds and blues and greens dancing over the snow like reflections of forgotten summers. Elias stopped before the church gates, his breath catching. His body felt as though carved from ice, every muscle sore, every step an effort. But inside, warmth bloomed, quiet and certain. The vicar's words still lingered in his mind. "You've kept the promise of Christmas alive." Thomas placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You should rest, lad," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "You've done more than enough." Elias shook his head, smiling faintly. "Not yet. The church lamp still burns weak. I can see it flicker from here." Father Alcott, standing at the open doors, stepped forward. The candlelight behind him framed his silhouette like a halo. "Come in, Elias," he called softly. "Warm yourself. We can finish the rest." But Elias only lifted his lantern and began walking up the steps. "If I can still stand," he said, "then I can still light." The doors creaked open wider, letting out a wave of warmth and candle scent. The villagers who had gathered inside turned as he entered, men, women, and children whose faces glowed with relief and wonder. Some began to applaud softly, though most simply watched, hands clasped, hearts quiet. Elias walked slowly down the aisle. His boots left wet marks on the old wooden floor, the sound of his steps echoing faintly through the vaulted ceiling. The air inside smelled of pine and wax, of stone warmed by prayer. The organ sat silent in the corner, but it didn't matter. The hush of reverence filled the space. When he reached the altar, he set down his satchel. His fingers trembled as he opened the final tin of oil. He climbed the narrow steps up to the great lamp, an ancient iron fixture suspended by a chain from the rafters. Its wick had burned almost to the base. The flame wavered, dim and tired. He poured the last of the oil carefully, hands steady despite the fatigue that pulled at him. Then, lowering his lantern, he touched its flame to the lamp's wick. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a soft sigh, the wick caught. The flame bloomed slowly, unfurling into life. Small at first, then taller, brighter, fuller. The light spilled outward, touching the pews, the rafters, the faces of those gathered. The church brightened until even the darkest corners glowed with golden warmth. Someone began to weep softly. Others bowed their heads. Thomas, standing at the doorway, whispered, "He's done it. The light's whole again." The vicar crossed himself, voice trembling. "It is as if the sun itself were reborn inside these walls." Elias stepped back from the lamp, his work done. The flame reflected in his eyes, twin mirrors of gold. For the first time that night, he felt the exhaustion leave him, not replaced by strength, but by peace. The villagers began to sing once more, but now their voices were not weary. They were joyous. The hymn rose up through the church, like wings unfurling, rich and full, filling every space with life. Outside, the last of the storm clouds began to drift apart. Through the window above the altar, a faint shimmer of moonlight broke through, joining the glow of the lamp until the whole church seemed to breathe with light from both heaven and earth. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting it all wash over him, the warmth, the sound, the peace. And for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to rest. He turned toward the congregation, his voice low but clear. "The lamps will burn all night," he said. "Let them be our promise, to never let darkness stand alone." The people nodded, some smiling, others weeping quietly. And as Father Alcott stepped forward to embrace him, the great bell in the tower began to ring, slow, solemn, triumphant. Its deep tones rolled through the night, echoing across the valley, carrying with it the message that light, faith, and warmth had endured another storm. Elias looked up toward the sound, whispering a prayer only he could hear. Outside, beyond the snow, the world seemed to listen. When the church bell's final echo faded into the hush of snow, Harrows Hollow seemed to exhale as one living being. The storm was gone. The air had turned still and soft, as if the world itself wished not to disturb the peace now settled over the village. Elias stepped out of the church, the warm glow spilling behind him through the heavy wooden doors. All along the streets, every window burned with light. Soft candle flames, hearth fires, lanterns and oil lamps, all joining in a silent chorus of warmth. The village, once dark and frozen, now shimmered in hues of gold and amber, the snow reflecting it all like polished glass. The rooftops gleamed faintly, crowned in starlight. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight and calm, no longer torn by wind. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of presence, a kind of reverent stillness that only follows great struggle and survival. Elias stood on the church steps for a long while, his lantern still in hand, though he no longer needed it. His breath came slow and even, a white thread in the cold night air. His body was exhausted, but his heart was calm. The flames he had carried, both in his lamp and within himself, had reached their home. Thomas Greer joined him, moving slowly, the old man's cane leaving deep prints in the snow. He looked out over the square and gave a soft, satisfied grunt. "Would you look at that boy?" he said quietly. "Every house lit, every heart awake." Elias nodded. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He didn't need them. The sight said everything. Children ran laughing through the street, their small boots kicking up clouds of white dust. They trailed behind them ribbons of golden light from the lanterns they held, borrowed from their parents' windows. One little girl, Clara, with the red mittens, waved at him. "Mr. Wren," she called, "you brought the light back." He smiled faintly, his voice little more than a whisper. "No, little one, you kept it waiting for me." The girl laughed and darted away again, her voice joining the other children's like bells in the night. Across the square, Mrs. Alcott and her husband were handing out loaves of warm bread wrapped in cloth, their steam curling into the air. Someone struck up a carol, a soft one, and others began to hum along. Windows opened, people leaning out to wave, to call thanks, to lift candles high, so that their glow joined the others. And in every window, rich or poor, near or far, a single flame burned. Some were tall and proud, others small and trembling, but none were dark. It was as if the whole village had decided, wordlessly and together, that they would keep the light alive until morning. Elias turned his face upward. The clouds had thinned enough to reveal the stars, sharp and clear in the night sky. The moon hung low, pale and benevolent, watching over the village below. Its light touched the snow, mingling with the golden lamplight, and for a moment the line between heaven and earth seemed to blur. He thought of the widow Miriam and her steadfast candle still burning by the riverbank. He thought of the mysterious light that guided him across the frozen bridge, of the bells that sang beneath the snow. He thought of his father's voice, long gone but never forgotten, whispering, "The lost always find their way by the light they keep alive." Thomas looked up beside him, the old man's eyes glistening. "Strange, isn't it? How one small flame can turn a night like this into something holy." Elias nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what Christmas has always meant," he said softly. "To keep the light, even when the world forgets how." The two men stood together in silence, listening to the murmur of voices and the distant hum of song. The lamps flickered gently in the wind, steady and sure. And then, almost as if the village itself sensed it was safe to rest, a calm began to fall. The children's laughter grew quieter. Doors closed softly, curtains drew. One by one, the voices faded into whispers, and soon only the lamps and the snow remained awake. It was a village wrapped in light, 1,000 small stars resting gently on earth. Elias looked out across the glowing rooftops and felt something deep within him settle, peaceful and full. For the first time in many winters, Harrows Hollow was not afraid of the dark. He took a slow breath, let it go, and whispered into the night, "Rest well, my friends. The lamps will keep watch." The night had turned utterly still, that rare stillness that comes only after a long storm, when the world itself seems to hold its breath. The air was crystalline, cold enough that every exhale shimmered like smoke, yet gentle now, no longer cruel. The lamps that lined Harrows Hollow stood tall and unwavering, their light pooling on the snow in halos of molten gold. Elias walked slowly down the street, each step leaving a soft, perfect impression in the powder. The village that had once been buried in shadow now seemed to glow from within. Every window whispered a story. A mother tucking in her children beneath a patchwork quilt, a couple sitting by a hearth in quiet gratitude, an old man whispering a prayer of thanks before sleep. The sound of the great church bell had faded, leaving behind a profound silence. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that feels sacred. The storm had taken much, the fences, the roof tiles, the calm of ordinary life. But it had also given them something far more precious, the proof that warmth could return even to the coldest heart. Elias stopped at the lamppost near the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread still lingered faintly in the air. The lamp above him burned steady and proud, its glass clear now, the frost melted away by its own gentle heat. He tilted his head to look up at it. The flame swayed slightly, almost like it was bowing in greeting. He smiled faintly, his breath curling into the glow. "You held on longer than I expected," he murmured. "Good work." His voice was soft, but the street seemed to listen. Somewhere nearby, a cat darted across the snow, leaving a winding trail of tiny paw prints. A horse snorted from a nearby stable, the sound comforting and familiar. The night had returned to itself. Thomas Greer had gone home at last, after Elias had promised to check each lamp one final time. The old man's house stood just at the end of the road, its windows burning warm and steady. Elias had watched him go, slow steps, leaning on his cane until the door closed gently behind him. Now, alone, Elias continued his rounds. He moved from lamp to lamp, his movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. He checked each wick, each glass panel, each pool of reflected light. His gloves were stiff with frost, but his heart was full. Every flicker reminded him of the people who depended on that glow. The widow's candle, the vicar's prayer, the children's laughter. Each flame was a soul in its way. By the time he reached the square again, the snow had stopped falling entirely. The sky above had turned deep violet, stars shining like pinpricks through sheer silk. The moon hovered low over the hills, silver and solemn. He paused before the church once more. Its great window glowed from within, the colors of the stained glass made brilliant by the lamplight inside. Red and blue and gold danced across the snow like a dream. Elias sat down on the stone steps, setting his lantern beside him. The flame within it was small now, flickering low. He loosened his scarf and leaned back, resting his head against the cold stone wall. For the first time since he'd left the northern farm, he allowed himself to breathe, really breathe, without rush or fear. The cold nipped at his face, but it felt clean, pure. His limbs were heavy, but in that heaviness was a peace he hadn't known for years. The world, for once, didn't need him to move. The light had returned. The village was safe. He tilted his head toward his lantern. "You did well," he whispered, voice barely audible. "You made it home." The tiny flame quivered, brightened once, and then steadied, a small, eternal glow. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. Father Alcott stepped out of the church, his robe trailing lightly across the snow. "Elias," he called softly, "come inside, son. There's soup on the fire. You must be frozen through." Elias smiled faintly, eyes half closed. "In a moment, Father," he murmured. "I'll stay until the lamps settle." The vicar nodded, understanding that there was a ritual in this, the final watch before rest. He left the door slightly ajar, letting a faint wedge of warmth spill into the night. Elias sat there for a long while, watching the lamps. The snow gleamed under their light, smooth as silk. The soft hum of the village's slumber seemed to rise around him. The quiet breathing of houses, the faint crackle of distant fires, the deep, slow rhythm of peace. The flame in his lantern wavered gently. Its reflection glimmered in his eyes. He whispered to the night, almost to himself. Let it burn all through the night. Let no one wake to darkness. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and rested beneath the gentle watch of the lamps that burned on, faithful, eternal, unafraid. The cold stone steps beneath Elias were firm, grounding, and oddly comforting. The glow of the street lamps shimmered across the square, soft and golden, mingling with the moonlight that poured silver ribbons over the rooftops. Harrows Hollow had never looked so serene. Not in any memory he carried. He sat in stillness for a long while, lantern beside him, the flame inside burning like the heart of the night. Fatigue tugged at him gently, not with pain, but with peace. His body, weary from the long journey, began to sink into a calm so deep it felt like the world itself had wrapped him in warmth. His thoughts drifted like snowflakes on a slow wind. The sounds around him blurred into a quiet lullaby, the faint crackle of a chimney, the sigh of wind in the trees beyond the village, the distant murmur of an owl calling from the hills. It was the kind of silence that held every sound tenderly, so that nothing seemed lost. Elias's eyes grew heavy. He tilted his head back, letting the cold air touch his face. It was clean and sharp, smelling of pine, smoke, and the faint sweetness of beeswax from the church candles. He hadn't realized until now just how deeply he'd missed that scent, the smell of home, of belonging. And as his breathing slowed, he began to dream. In his dream, he was no longer sitting on the church steps, but standing in a meadow of frost-lit grass. The snow around him glowed faintly with its own light, untouched, pure. Above, the stars shimmered, not distant, but close, like lanterns hung from a vast ceiling of glass. Each one flickered in rhythm with his heartbeat. From the far edge of the meadow, a figure began to walk toward him. Her steps made no sound, and yet the air seemed to hum softly with her presence. When she came close enough for the light to touch her face, Elias saw her clearly. His mother, her eyes kind and shining, as he remembered them, her hands clasped in front of her. She smiled, her voice as gentle as falling snow. "You've kept the flame, my son." Elias swallowed hard. "I nearly lost it," he said. His voice sounded younger here, like a boy's. "But you didn't," she said, reaching out to touch the lantern that hung from his hand. "You carried it through the storm, and that's what matters." It was never about how bright the flame burned, only that it lived long enough to be passed on. Her touch was warm. The lantern in his hand glowed brighter, golden light spilling across the meadow. The stars above flickered in answer, pulsing softly as though they recognized their kin. "Do you see?" she whispered. "Every light you save tonight will give birth to another. Every child who sleeps beneath it will wake, believing in warmth again. And so the flame continues, through hands, through hearts, through time." Elias felt tears prick his eyes. "Will it ever go out?" His mother smiled. "Only when the last soul forgets how to hope. And that will never happen. Not while there are people like you." The meadow shimmered brighter, the snow turning to light beneath their feet. Elias could see faint shapes around them now. The villagers of Harrows Hollow, standing in the distance, each holding a lantern that glowed like a heartbeat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. His mother's form began to fade, her light merging with the others. "Rest now," she said. "You've done what few ever do. You've carried warmth through the coldest night." "Will I see you again?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. "In every flame," she whispered, her voice already dissolving into the quiet air. "In every light that refuses to die." Then the world around him dissolved into a soft haze of gold and silver, the meadow fading, the stars dimming one by one, until there was only the gentle flicker of a single flame left. When Elias opened his eyes again, dawn was rising. The snow had turned pale blue under the early light, and a faint warmth touched his cheek. The church bells were ringing softly, not in alarm, but in greeting. Morning had come, bright and alive. He blinked against the light, smiling faintly as realization dawned. He must have drifted into sleep, lantern beside him, head bowed beneath the quiet watch of the lamps. The village stirred awake slowly. Doors creaked open, voices whispered, "Good morning," and thin trails of chimney smoke curled upward once more. And all through Harrows Hollow the lamps were still burning. Their flames, golden and soft, swayed gently in the morning breeze, a promise kept, a night survived, a light unbroken. Elias rose slowly to his feet, stretching his stiff arms. The world felt lighter now, and though the cold still lingered, it no longer bit. He turned once to look at the lamps lining the street, their glass catching the first kiss of sunlight. They no longer needed him to keep them alive. They had learned to shine on their own. He smiled, touched the lantern at his side, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping watch." When the first sunlight broke over the hills, Harrows Hollow glittered like a kingdom carved from light. The snow that had once buried it now shimmered in pale gold and soft rose. Every drift turned into a mirror for the dawn. The air was hushed, not silent, but full of a delicate calm, the kind that comes after hardship, when the world seems to pause to remember that it has survived. The lamps still burned, every single one. Elias stood in the square, his coat still dusted with frost, watching the morning light mix with the lamplight. It was a rare sight, the two forms of brightness blending together, day and night, sharing the same breath for a moment before the world changed hands. The oil he had carried through the storm had done more than fuel the lamps. It had carried the spirit of the people, their belief that warmth could outlast even the longest cold. Father Alcott emerged from the church, his robe gathered against the morning breeze. He paused at the top of the steps, looking down at the glowing streets below, then smiled. A deep, quiet smile that reached his tired eyes. "Look," he said softly, "the lamps have outlived the storm." Elias turned to him, his breath forming small clouds in the pale air. "They've burned all night," he replied, his voice still hoarse from cold. "They never once faltered." The vicar nodded. "Because faith never truly does. Even when we think it's gone, it hides in small things, a candle in a window, a song in a child's voice, a traveller's flame against the wind." He descended the steps and placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "You gave us that reminder." Elias looked down, humbled. "I only carried the light," he murmured. "And what a thing it is to carry," said the vicar gently. "Most men forget to even try." The two of them stood together for a moment, watching as the villagers began to stir. Doors opened, boots crunched in the snow, laughter echoed faintly down the lanes. The bakery's chimney sent up a plume of soft grey smoke that caught the sunrise like a ribbon. The smell of bread mingled with the faint tang of oil and winter air. Children emerged next, rubbing sleep from their eyes, running to see the lamps that still glowed faintly even in daylight. Clara, the girl with the red mittens, skipped across the square and stopped in front of Elias. She looked up at him, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with wonder. "They didn't go out," she said, beaming. "Not even once." Elias crouched, his knees creaking. "That's right," he said softly. "They kept their promise." Clara leaned in closer, peering at his lantern, which still flickered weakly. "Is that the first one?" He nodded. "The one that led me here." She clasped her hands together and whispered, as though speaking to the flame itself, "Thank you." The simple earnestness of it made Elias's throat tighten. He looked up and saw that others had gathered around. The baker, the blacksmith, the widow Miriam, who had lit her candle by the river. They all stood in the golden light, quiet smiles on their faces. There was no grand speech, no applause, only the shared understanding that something sacred had passed through the night and remained. Miriam stepped forward, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. "I kept my candle burning," she said softly, "just as I promised." Elias smiled warmly. "And I saw it," he replied. "It guided me through the valley." She touched his hand briefly, her skin warm despite the cold. "Then it was worth every drop of wax." The morning bells began to chime again, soft, melodic, unhurried. Their sound drifted across the rooftops, mingling with birdsong as the first sparrows returned to perch on the lamp posts. The entire village seemed to awaken to that sound, stretching and breathing in the light. And there, in that golden hour, Harrows Hollow felt reborn. The lamps, though no longer needed to hold back the dark, remained lit. It was Father Alcott's decree, and everyone agreed. For that day, the lamps would burn as a symbol of endurance, a reminder of what unity and warmth could do against the coldest storm. Elias tilted his face to the sky. The sun, now high above the hills, gleamed faintly through thin ribbons of cloud. Its warmth brushed his skin, almost startling after the bitter night. The frost on his coat began to melt, the drops glinting like tiny gems. Thomas Greer appeared from the bakery door, munching on a crust of bread, his cane tucked under one arm. "Well now," he said, grinning crookedly, "you've gone and made me obsolete. Every light in town's burning without me." Elias chuckled, rubbing his hands together for warmth.
"I think the lamp's earned a day off, and so have you." The old lamplighter laughed, a deep, rough sound. "Aye, maybe so, but I'll not mind keeping an eye on them anyway. Habit's hard to kill." Elias smiled, watching the smoke curl lazily upward into the calm air. "Some things shouldn't be killed at all," he said. "Especially not light." The others nodded, and for a long moment they all stood in silence. Men, women, and children gathered under the rising sun, surrounded by the lamps that had burned through the longest night.
The snow glittered like crushed glass beneath their feet, and somewhere far away the last whisper of the storm faded completely, leaving behind nothing but peace. By midday the village had transformed. The golden haze of morning had given way to soft daylight that sparkled on the rooftops like powdered diamonds. The lamps still burned along the streets, their flames steady and small against the growing sun, but the people of Harrows Hollow refused to extinguish them. They had become part of something sacred now, a quiet covenant between darkness and light. From every house came the sound of laughter, the creak of doors opening, and the smell of cooking that wove through the crisp air. Pots clanged, fires crackled, and for the first time since the storm began, the sound of music, fiddles, flutes, and humming voices returned to the hollow. It was Christmas Day 1892, and though many had feared they would wake to ruin, they woke instead to renewal. In the square, tables were carried out, covered with linens, and loaded with bread, roasted roots, salted meats, and apples baked with sugar and spice. The air grew rich with scent, smoke, cinnamon, butter melting on hot loaves. Children ran between the benches with red cheeks, their laughter rising like birds into the cold sky. Elias stood off to one side, still weary but warmed by the sight. His lantern hung from his belt now, its flame faint in the daylight but alive. People greeted him as they passed, some pressing his hands in gratitude, others simply nodding with quiet respect. Father Alcott raised a wooden cup in the center of the crowd. "To the light that burned through the storm," he said, "and to those who carried it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the villagers. Some lifted mugs of steaming cider, others simply smiled, eyes bright with emotion. The vicar turned, gesturing toward Elias. "To Elias Wren, who walked through frost and darkness to bring us warmth." Elias shook his head quickly, his cheeks coloring. "No," he said softly, voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "To all of you, for waiting, for keeping faith when it was easier to give up. I carried oil, yes, but you carried hope." A hush fell, gentle and complete. Then slowly the people began to clap. Not loud or boisterous, but steady, rhythmic, grateful. It was a sound of recognition, of hearts aligned. Elias lowered his head, humbled. The applause faded into laughter, into warmth. Miriam, the widow from the river, appeared beside him with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said, pressing it into his hands. He opened it carefully. Inside was a loaf of her bread, still warm, and a stub of beeswax candle. "The last of my batch," she said. "You'll need it for the next journey, I imagine." Elias smiled faintly, touched. "Thank you, Miriam. I'll keep it burning." She nodded. "I know you will." As afternoon drifted into early evening, the sky deepened to soft lavender, and the sun dipped low behind the western ridge. The snow caught the colors of dusk, pink, gold, and pale blue blending into one another until the world seemed painted in light. The lamps began to glow stronger again as daylight faded, as if they too had waited for their turn to shine once more. The children pointed at them excitedly, watching how the flames danced beneath their glass shells. Thomas Greer made his way to Elias's side, munching on a sweet bun. "You know," he said around a mouthful, "this town's never going to let you leave after this." Elias laughed softly. "I don't think I mind." Thomas grinned, his weathered face soft in the golden light. "You've got lamplighter's blood, boy. You'll find no better trade than guarding the night." "I think," Elias said quietly, gazing down the glowing streets, "that the night guards itself, through us, through each other." The old man chuckled, shaking his head.
"A poet now, are you?" Elias smiled, eyes soft. Maybe just a tired one. The music grew louder then, fiddles joining flutes, hands clapping, boots stamping. The people danced, slow and easy, spinning beneath the lamps whose golden glow wrapped them like firelight. Snowflakes began to fall again, light and lazy, drifting through the music, catching in hair and beards and candle flames without ever snuffing them out. It was as though the sky, too, had joined the celebration. Father Alcott lifted his voice once more, his tone warm and deep. "Tonight, let the lamps burn once again until morning. Let their light remind us, no storm, no night, no shadow lasts forever." A cheer rose from the crowd, full and bright, echoing off the hills. Elias watched as the people of Harrows Hollow feasted and laughed, their faces glowing in the light of the very lamps they had feared to lose. For the first time in years he felt not like a traveller, but like a man who had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. Above them, the stars began to pierce the indigo sky, each one steady and sure. The lamps flickered in answer, as if they too were stars, just closer to earth. Elias looked up at them, his lantern swinging gently at his side, and whispered to himself, "Let them burn, let them always burn." That night, the celebration quieted into something softer, gentler. The snow had begun again, not in anger but in peace, fine flakes that drifted slowly through the still air, catching in the lamplight like falling stars. The square was nearly empty now. The tables had been cleared, the fires banked, the children carried home by drowsy parents. Yet the village still glowed as if day lingered inside it. Elias sat on the low wall beside the fountain, his lantern beside him, the flame within moving in slow rhythm with his breath. Around him, the lamps hummed faintly, a sound that was not truly a sound but more a feeling, as though every flicker spoke the same wordless promise: we remain. The air was quiet enough to hear the snow landing. Soft shh sounds as it built delicate layers on rooftops and fences. He drew his coat closer, but not because of the cold. The cold was no longer his enemy. It had been tamed, gentled by the light that filled every corner. In the stillness, he heard something faint, a voice carried on the wind, though it was not a human voice. It was the whispering of air moving through chimneys, through pine boughs, through frozen eaves. And in that whisper was the echo of the storm, softened and changed. It no longer sounded like fury, it sounded like memory. Elias closed his eyes, listening. Within that distant wind, he heard snatches of the night's journey, the bells beneath the snow, the bridge that moaned under his weight, the widow's candle burning steady in her window. Every sound, every flicker, every soul who had believed that light would return. It was all there, woven into the air itself. He realized then that stories like flames did not stay still. They traveled.
They passed from one heart to another, growing stronger with each telling. And perhaps that was why he had come through the storm. Not merely to deliver oil, but to carry a story the wind itself would one day repeat. He smiled faintly at the thought. The wind brushed his face like a hand in passing, and the flame in his lantern bent, not in struggle, but in greeting. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a child's figure skipping down the lane, her lantern swinging from a stick. It was Clara again, still in her red mittens, her breath puffing small clouds of joy into the air. "Elias," she called softly. "Papa said I could keep my lantern burning all night. He says it's my job now." Elias chuckled, voice warm. "A fine job indeed. Be sure to watch it carefully." She nodded solemnly. "I will. I'll guard it till the sun wakes up." "Then you'll do better than most grown men ever have," he said, smiling. The girl grinned, then darted away again, her laughter echoing faintly between the houses, the light of her lantern weaving in and out like a firefly. Elias watched her go, something deep within him softening further. Perhaps that was what it meant to pass on a flame, not to keep it forever, but to entrust it to those who could carry it forward. As he sat there, the widow Miriam's candlelight flickered faintly in the distance, visible through the soft haze of snow. Beyond that, in the church tower, the great lamp still glowed steady, and from its belfry a faint golden light poured into the heavens. The wind shifted again, passing through the square with a sound almost like speech. Elias tilted his head, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard words within it. Words not of storm or sorrow, but of gratitude. "Thank you for the light." He smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the glow. "You're welcome," he whispered back, not certain to whom he spoke. The village, the night, the spirits of the storm, or perhaps all of them at once. The lantern flame beside him fluttered, then steadied, its light reflecting softly in his eyes. In that moment, he understood, the story of this night would not end when the lamps went out. It would move through time as quietly as snow, passed from hearth to hearth, from child to child, and long after he was gone, someone would still whisper of the year the lamps burned through Christmas, of the man who carried light through the blizzard. And when that story was told, perhaps a single candle would be lit in some window, and in its small glow, the memory of warmth would live again. Elias leaned back, closing his eyes, and let the whispering wind carry his thoughts away. Above him, the stars burned steadily, mirroring the lamps below. Heaven and earth, light and snow, man and memory, all of them, at last, in harmony. The dawn of the next day came softly, slipping into Harrows Hollow like a guest who didn't wish to wake the household. The lamps still burned, their flames pale now against the gentle glow of the new sun, but still alive. The storm was a memory, one written into every drift of snow, every melted path, every grateful heart. Elias woke in the small room above the bakery, wrapped in quilts that smelled faintly of flour and wood smoke. The baker's wife had insisted he sleep there, just for a night, until your strength returns. He had resisted at first, but fatigue had claimed him before he could protest again. Now, as he sat up, the morning light filtered through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the floorboards. The village below stirred with slow, peaceful motion. The sound of brooms sweeping porches, kettles whistling, doors opening to let in the day. He rose, stretching stiff muscles, and dressed carefully, his fingers still stiff from the cold. His lantern hung on a hook by the window, its flame finally extinguished. For a moment he just looked at it. The glass fogged from yesterday's cold, the metal slightly bent from the weight of the journey. Then, quietly, he smiled. "You've earned your rest," he murmured, brushing the soot-streaked frame with his thumb. When he stepped outside, the air was crisp but kind, scented faintly of baking bread and pine. The snow in the streets had been trampled into smooth, glittering paths, and everywhere he looked, the lamps still glowed faintly, though their flames were now dwarfed by daylight. No one had the heart to snuff them yet. He made his way toward the church. The bells had rung once at sunrise, but now they were silent. The door stood open, and the warm scent of wax and cedar drifted through it. Inside, Father Alcott sat at a wooden desk near the altar, writing something with careful, deliberate strokes. When he saw Elias approach, he smiled warmly. "Good morning, my son," he said. "You look rested." Elias nodded. "I am. It feels like the world has slept 100 years and woken new." The vicar chuckled softly. "Perhaps it has." He gestured to the paper before him. "I was writing the entry for our parish book. Every winter I record what the year has brought. Births, storms, blessings, losses. But this year," he paused, his quill hovering, "this year needed something special." Elias tilted his head. "What are you calling it?" Father Alcott smiled faintly. "The winter the lamps burned all night." Elias's breath caught for a moment. The words hung in the still air, like a prayer. The vicar continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "It will remind those who come after us that we once faced a darkness that might have taken everything, and that we fought it not with fear, but with light. You see, memory fades, Elias, but stories remain. And this story will tell itself long after we're gone." Elias stepped closer, watching, as the vicar's hand moved over the parchment, the ink glistening in the warm glow of a nearby candle. Each letter seemed to hold weight, not just of words, but of the countless moments that had brought them here. When the vicar finished, he blew gently across the ink, then folded the page and sealed it with wax. He held it out to Elias. "Would you do me the honor of placing this in the church archives?" Elias took it carefully, his fingers brushing the smooth seal. "Of course." As he turned to do so, the vicar added softly, "You should know. There will come another winter one day. There always does. But when it comes, our people will remember this one. They'll light their lamps and wait for dawn." Elias paused at the door to the small archive room. "Then I'll have done my part," he said. He placed the letter gently inside a wooden chest bound in iron among the other records of the village. Baptisms, marriages, and the oldest documents written in faded ink from long before either of them had lived. As he closed the lid, he rested his hand on the smooth wood for a moment, eyes closed. He could almost feel the heartbeat of the place, the pulse of generations, held in trust by those who had loved, fought, and endured. When he returned to the main hall, the sunlight had shifted, falling across the altar and bathing it in gold. The vicar had gone to tend to the candles, leaving Elias alone in the glow. He stood for a long time in the quiet, his breath steady, the warmth on his face gentle as a touch. Outside, a new wind was rising, not fierce, but light and wandering, curling through the village streets like a song. It carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke and honey, and as Elias stepped into it, he realized that it carried something else too, the story itself, already traveling. The people would tell it in their own word, of the man who crossed the storm with a lantern, of the widow who kept her candle, of the night the whole town learned that light, once shared, cannot die. And as the breeze drifted down the valley toward the river and beyond the ridge, Elias smiled, knowing that the world would remember not him, but the flame. He touched the lantern at his side one last time and whispered, "Go with them." The wind caught the words and carried them away, mingling them with sunlight and song. By the time the sun reached its noonday height, Harrows Hollow was once again alive with the small rhythms of ordinary life. Horses stamped in their stables, smoke curled from every chimney, and laughter drifted faintly from the baker's open window. Yet through it all the lamps still burned, quiet, steadfast reminders of the night that had changed everything. Elias stood at the edge of the village, where the road bent eastward toward the hills. His pack was lighter now. He had left most of his oil with Father Alcott, and his satchel carried only a few essentials: bread wrapped in cloth, a small flask of water, and the stub of Miriam's beeswax candle. His lantern hung from his belt, freshly cleaned and polished, its flame rekindled from one of the lamps in the square. Thomas Greer met him there, leaning on his cane, snow clinging to his boots. "You sure you want to go so soon?" the old lamplighter asked. "The folks would keep you another week if you let them." Elias smiled softly. "I know. But there are other villages out there, smaller, quieter. Some may still be buried in snow. Maybe they could use a little light of their own." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "Always the wanderer, eh? Well, take this then." He reached into his coat and produced a small brass key, dulled with age. "It's the spare to the church lamps. I've carried it 40 years, and I reckon you'll make better use of it now." Elias accepted the key with reverence. "I'll return it some day." The old man grinned. "No rush, boy. The light will wait." They stood for a moment, side by side, gazing down the winding road that cut through the snowfields and disappeared between the trees. The storm's damage was still visible: fallen branches, snowdrifts piled against fences, but already the world was healing. The sky above was a pale, impossible blue. Sunlight danced off the snow in silver sparks, and every tree branch dripped with melting frost, each droplet catching the light before falling to earth. As Elias adjusted his cloak, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Clara running toward him, her red mittens flashing like berries against the white. She held something small and glowing in her hands, a lantern no bigger than her palm. "Mama said this was Grandpapa's," she said, breathless. "He used to carry it when he went to check the sheep. I want you to take it." Elias crouched, his breath misting between them. "Are you sure? It's a fine lantern." Clara nodded solemnly. "If you take it, maybe the other towns will see our light too." Her words struck him deeply. Simple, pure, truer than any sermon. He took the tiny lantern gently from her hands, its glass warm from her touch. "Then I'll carry it for both of us," he said. "And wherever I go, I'll tell them about the little girl in the red mittens who helped keep a whole town awake through the dark." Clara giggled, shyly hiding her face in her scarf.
"Promise?" "Promise." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Go on, lad, before you start melting into sentiment. The road's calling you." Elias laughed, the sound low and genuine. He took one last look at Harrows Hollow, the church steeple glinting in the sunlight, the smoke curling lazily, the faint glimmer of every lamp still burning in windows and along the streets. It was not just a village anymore. It was a living constellation of faith. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into fresh snow. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of light caught between shadowed trees.
With each step, the crunch of snow fell into rhythm with the steady heartbeat of his lantern's glow. As he reached the bend in the road, he paused and turned. From this distance, the whole hollow shimmered softly, nestled in the valley like a handful of golden stars. For a moment, it seemed that heaven itself had descended to earth. he raised his lantern in silent farewell. The flame inside caught the sunlight, blazing briefly brighter than before, as if it too wished to say goodbye. Thomas lifted his cane in reply, and though the distance between them widened, Elias could still hear the old man's voice carried faintly on the wind. "Keep it burning, boy! Wherever you go, keep it burning!" Elias smiled, turning toward the open road. "Always," he whispered. And so he walked east, the snow crunching beneath his feet, the horizon stretching before him in gold and white. The world was vast, and winter would come again, but so would the light. Behind him, in the hollow that had once feared the dark, the lamps continued to burn, faithful and bright, marking the place where hope had survived a storm. Elias followed the eastern road for many hours, his boots creaking softly against the thinning snow. The world beyond Harrows Hollow was vast and still, a wilderness of pale hills and silver trees bending beneath the weight of frost. The storm had scoured the land clean, leaving everything gleaming and new. The wind was gentle now, no longer cruel. It moved like a living breath through the pines, humming low, carrying the scent of resin and faraway hearth smoke. It was the smell of distant life, of warmth hiding just out of sight. Elias's lantern swayed at his side, its light small in the brightness of day, but steady. The little brass key from Thomas hung around his neck, glinting faintly with every step. In his pocket, wrapped in cloth, he kept the tiny lantern Clara had given him. Every so often he would touch it gently, as though it were a promise he could feel with his fingers. The road curved down into a wide valley. There, scattered across the snow, Elias began to see signs of other villages, faint trails of smoke rising from chimneys, fences half buried in drift, the tops of barns peeking above the white. The air grew warmer as he descended, the snow thinner, the ground crunching softly beneath him. When he reached the first settlement, a small hamlet nestled among the birches, he found it strangely silent. The houses stood close together, roofs heavy with frost, doors shut tight against the cold, but the lamps that lined their single street were dark, their glass fogged, their wicks drowned in ice. Elias paused in the center of the empty road. A hush lay over everything, deep and absolute. He could hear only his own breath, the faint whisper of wind, and the far-off crack of shifting snow. He understood at once. These people had lost their light. Something within him stirred, not pity, but purpose. He knelt beside the nearest lamp, brushing the frost from its glass. Inside, the wick was intact, but dry, brittle from neglect. He reached for the tin of oil at his belt, poured carefully, then touched his own lantern's flame to the wick. The light caught slowly, then bloomed. A thin column of golden warmth rose through the cold air. The flame wavered, then steadied, casting long shadows that spilled across the snow. The silence changed. Somewhere behind one of the shutters, a voice gasped softly. A curtain moved, then another. One by one, faces began to appear in windows, tired, pale, but wide-eyed. A door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out, her shawl drawn tight, her breath visible. "Who's there?" she called, voice trembling. Elias lifted his lantern. "A friend," he said gently. "I bring back the light." The woman blinked at him, uncertain, then looked at the glowing lamp beside him. Her eyes filled with tears. "We thought we'd lost it," she whispered. "Not lost," Elias said softly. "Just waiting." He moved to the next lamp, and the next. His hands worked carefully, rhythmically. With each one that bloomed to life, the air seemed to grow warmer. doors began to open. People emerged, children clinging to their parents, men brushing frost from their coats. Soon, half the hamlet stood in the street, faces lifted toward the returning glow. A small boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, "is it Christmas again?" She smiled faintly through tears. "Perhaps," she said. "Perhaps it never really ended." Elias lit the final lamp and stepped back, watching as the golden light spilled across the valley, touching the snow, the trees, the faces of the people who had almost forgotten what warmth looked like. For a moment, it was as though the lamps of Harrows Hollow had found their reflection here, a twin flame spreading across the world. The old woman approached him again, her voice shaking. "Who are you, traveler?" Elias hesitated, then smiled softly. "Just a keeper of the light." She reached out, taking his hand in both of hers. "Then may your flame never die." He bowed his head. "Nor yours." As evening settled, he shared bread with them, listening to their laughter, their stories, their quiet joy at seeing their lamps alive again. They spoke of the storm that had sealed them in, of nights spent in darkness, praying for morning. Elias told them only this: light finds its way back, always. When the stars rose and the lamps of the valley burned like a mirror to the sky above, Elias knew it was time to continue. The people offered him food and a bed, but he only smiled, pointing to the horizon. "There are more valleys," he said. "More nights that still need dawn." He shouldered his pack, lifted his lantern, and began to walk again, his flame small but unwavering, a single spark against the immense dark. Behind him, the people of the valley watched until he disappeared among the birches. Then, turning toward their newly lit streets, they began to sing, the same hymn the villagers of Harrows Hollow had sung when the storm broke. "Through frost and fear our hearts shall stay, while lamps of love still light the way." The sound drifted after him like wind through bells, following him into the night. Night came quietly over the birch valley, folding the world once again in its dark velvet cloak. The stars appeared one by one, steady and clear against the deep blue sky. Their light touched the frozen branches, and in the distance, the small hamlet Elias had left behind shimmered faintly, its street lamps glowing like a constellation on the earth. Elias paused on the ridge above the valley and looked back. From where he stood, the lamps were tiny points of gold, scattered like fireflies in the snow. The sight filled him with something more than pride. It was peace, vast and humbling, a knowledge that what he had done here would live far beyond him. He whispered into the still air, "Keep burning." The wind caught his words and carried them down through the trees, as if to deliver his message to every window, every flame. The road ahead curved eastward, winding through forests thick with pine and spruce. The snow here was untouched, the silence deeper, the night more profound. His lantern threw a small, warm circle around him as he walked, each flake of snow that drifted through its light momentarily turning to gold before vanishing into shadow. He walked for hours, the rhythm of his boots on snow like a slow heartbeat. Though the cold bit at his cheeks and fingers, his heart burned steady. Inside his coat, he kept the little brass key and the child's lantern wrapped in cloth, and every so often he touched them both just to remind himself that he was not alone in this purpose. Near midnight he came to a crossroads where the forest opened into a wide clearing. In its center stood an old waystone, its surface carved with runes too worn to read, its base surrounded by frozen moss. Someone long ago had set a lantern hook into the top of the stone, though it hung empty now. Elias stopped before it. The silence was so complete that he could hear the soft hiss of his own breath and the faint creak of the lantern handle in his hand. Above him, the stars wheeled slowly, watching. He knelt, brushed the frost from the old hook, and hung his lantern there. The flame within wavered, then steadied, casting long shadows across the clearing. Its glow touched the runes, revealing faint patterns, spirals, circles, shapes like rays of light. He understood, without needing words, what the stone was. A marker for travelers, a place where those who wandered could find direction, if only for a little while. Elias stood back, watching the flame dance in the cold air. "You'll do," he murmured. "You'll keep watch for those who come after." He poured a few drops of oil into the basin below the stone, a quiet offering to the road and all who would walk it. Then he took out Clara's tiny lantern, the one she had given him with such solemn promise. Its wick was unlit, waiting. With careful hands, he held it near the flame of his own lantern until the spark caught. The small lantern glowed softly, its light pure and steady. He whispered, "For Harrows Hollow, for every place that still waits for dawn." Then he turned his face toward the eastern hills and continued his journey, carrying the smaller flame now, letting his own larger lantern burn on the stone behind him. He didn't look back, but in his heart he knew that two lights now guarded the road instead of one. The forest around him seemed to change as he walked. The snow reflected the faint glow behind him, and the trees shimmered as if they had swallowed a bit of that light. The world was no longer black and white, but full of quiet shades, silver, ivory, pale gold. Hours passed, the stars wheeled higher, and a low mist began to gather across the ground. It moved like breath, curling around his boots. Within it, he thought he heard whispers, gentle, melodic, like voices singing from very far away. He smiled faintly. "You've found me again, haven't you?" It was the same wind song that had followed him from Harrows Hollow, carrying the memory of the lamps, of laughter, of voices lifted in hope. It was the world remembering. He let the sound guide him forward, each note leading him deeper into the forest, each step leaving a faint trail of light on the snow. The trees grew denser, but not threatening. They seemed to bend slightly toward him, their branches heavy with frost that glittered like glass. When the whispers finally faded, Elias stopped to rest beneath a massive pine. Its trunk was wide enough to shelter him from the wind, and its needles smelled sharp and clean. He hung the small lantern from a low branch, its glow illuminating a small circle of peace amid the vast darkness. As he sat there, knees drawn to his chest, he spoke softly into the quiet. "I'll carry it as far as I can, and when I can't anymore, someone else will. The light always finds another hand." The flame flickered as though in answer. He leaned back against the tree, eyes heavy with sleep, but his heart calm. The forest exhaled around him, and the night settled into stillness. Above, the stars burned clear and endless. And beneath them, one man and one small lantern kept their vigil, two tiny, steadfast fires in a world of snow. Elias woke to the sound of the forest breathing. It wasn't wind exactly. It was softer than that, more like the sigh of something vast and alive. The pines around him swayed gently, their long branches whispering against one another in the pale grey light before dawn. Snow drifted from their needles in slow, lazy spirals, landing silently on his coat. The little lantern still hung from the branch above him, its flame untroubled, steady as a heartbeat. He smiled faintly at it, stretching his aching legs before standing. The cold air bit at his skin but felt clean, pure, and full of life. All around him, the forest was veiled in mist. It coiled low along the ground, winding between tree trunks like breath through the ribs of the earth. The scent of pine resin, wet bark, and faint smoke filled the air. The timeless perfume of a winter morning deep in the wilderness. He reached up and took the lantern gently from the branch. Its warmth against his glove was a small miracle, one he never grew tired of. "Still with me, then?" he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Good." As he began walking, the pines seemed to part for him. The path beneath his boots was narrow but visible, a faint track pressed into the snow by older feet long before his. The trees leaned close, their dark shapes towering above him, but instead of shadowing him, they seemed to guard him. It was quiet here, but not empty. The forest had a voice, 1,000 tiny sounds layered over one another. The creak of branches, the soft trickle of melting frost, the distant crack of ice on some unseen pond. All of it merged into a slow, steady rhythm that kept pace with his steps. And somewhere within that rhythm, Elias began to hear something else, a whisper. At first, he thought it was only the wind curling through the trees, but the sound was too deliberate, too familiar. It came in waves, rising and falling with the sway of the forest. "Keeper." He froze, the word rippling faintly through the mist. His breath plumed out in white clouds. "Who's there?" he called softly. No answer came, only the slow sighing of the pines. But then it came again, gentler, almost fond. "Keeper of the flame." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, moving through the air like music. Elias stood still, his lantern raised. The light caught the mist, turning it into a golden haze. Through it, he thought he saw shapes, faint outlines of figures between the trees. They flickered in and out of view like reflections on water. He didn't feel afraid. The air was too calm, too reverent. Whatever these presences were, they meant no harm. "Who are you?" he whispered. The mist shifted, and a figure stepped forward, tall, graceful, barely more than light and shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, like two small embers in a face made of winter air. When it spoke, its voice was the rustle of leaves, the sound of falling snow. "The light you carry has walked these woods before." Elias's brow furrowed. "You've seen it?" The figure inclined its head. "Long before your time, the flame moved through this forest, not in a lantern but in hearts. It burns in those who remember warmth, even when surrounded by cold." Elias stepped closer, the snow creaking softly beneath his boots. "Then it's the same light, the same that burned in Harrows Hollow." "The same that burns everywhere it is needed," said the voice. "You are its keeper, but not its owner. You carry what has been passed from hand to hand through countless winters." The air shimmered faintly, and the other figures in the mist began to move. Dozens, maybe hundreds, faint outlines drifting like smoke between the trees. Some carried faint sparks cupped in their hands. Others simply glowed, their very forms illuminated from within. "We were keepers once," said the voice. "Long before names and roads. When the first cold came and the world forgot warmth, we bore the light across the mountains. And when we could carry it no farther, others took it." Elias's throat tightened.
"And now, I've taken it from you?" The figure's gaze softened, the embers in its eyes dimming to a calm glow. "You took nothing, child. You continued what must never end." The mist swirled gently around him. Elias felt warmth on his skin, a warmth that wasn't from his lantern. It radiated from the forest itself, from the air, from the memory of all who had ever carried light through darkness. He bowed his head, overwhelmed. "Then I'll keep it burning, as long as I live." The figure reached forward, not touching him, but letting a faint thread of light stretch from its hand to his lantern.
The flame within grew brighter, steadier, stronger. "When you falter," said the voice, "remember this. No flame belongs to one alone. The moment it is shared, it becomes eternal." Elias raised his eyes, and the figures were gone. Only the trees remained, swaying softly in the morning breeze. But the mist still glowed faintly, and the air still hummed with quiet power. He looked down at his lantern. The flame had changed. It was no longer just a soft yellow. It burned with a subtle warmth of gold and rose, its edges shimmering like sunlight through frost. He smiled, whispering to himself, "Not mine, but ours." The forest sighed, and the wind began to move again, guiding him forward along the hidden path. Elias walked on, the whisper of the pines following him like a prayer. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to thin, and the pines gave way to open ground. Elias stepped out into a vast white expanse, a frozen lake, still and endless, under the pale winter sun. Its surface gleamed like polished glass, faintly blue, stretching toward distant hills draped in snow. The air here was sharper, echoing with a silence so pure it almost sang. Elias paused at the lake's edge, his breath frosting in the cold. Beneath the ice, faint shadows moved, or seemed to. He crouched and brushed snow away with his mitten, revealing smooth, perfect ice. His reflection looked back at him, weary, frostbitten, eyes shadowed by fatigue and wonder alike. But behind his reflection, in that faint shimmer of light, he thought he saw others. Faces, dozens, maybe hundreds, faint and translucent, watching from beneath the surface. They weren't frightening. Their expressions were calm, solemn, and kind. They shimmered as though made of starlight caught in ice. Elias's breath caught. "Who are you?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but as a soft vibration through the ground, a note felt rather than heard. The air above the ice shimmered faintly, and in the reflection the faint shapes of lamps appeared, not in the physical world, but mirrored in the ice, rows of glowing orbs stretching out into infinity. He realized what he was seeing. These were the lights of every place that had ever kept the flame, lamps, hearths, candles, stars, all connected, each reflection echoing another. It was as though the world itself remembered every moment someone had chosen warmth over darkness. Kneeling there, Elias spoke quietly to the reflection. "I've seen your light. I've carried it through snow and wind and silence, but how can I know it will last when I am gone?" The answer came again, faint ripples spreading across the ice. The reflections of the lamps brightened, and in them he saw glimpses of future winters, of people yet unborn lighting candles, lanterns, fires. Villages that did not yet exist, children carrying lamps in processions, solitary travelers walking with small flames through endless nights. The message was clear. The light will last because it always finds a keeper. Elias smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "Then I'll keep it as long as I can," he whispered. "And when I can't—" He trailed off, looking up at the horizon. The wind shifted then, sweeping softly across the lake, stirring a faint cloud of frost that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. In that moment, it felt as though the world itself answered, "Another will take your place." The ice creaked softly beneath his boots like a sigh of approval. He rose, the lantern swinging at his side, casting ripples of light across the frozen surface. The color of the flame had changed since the forest. It burned now with the faint blush of rose gold, alive and warm, even in the heart of the cold. Its reflection in the ice shimmered brightly, then split into 1,000 smaller sparks that danced outward like fireflies beneath the glass. Elias stepped onto the lake carefully. The ice held firm beneath his weight, its smoothness reflecting the sky in perfect clarity. Each step echoed softly as though he walked across the skin of the heavens. Midway across, he stopped and looked down again. The reflections below were moving now, not like ghosts, but like memories. Scenes of nights gone by. He saw Harrows Hollow, the lamps burning bright. He saw Miriam's candle flickering steadfastly by the window. He saw Thomas leaning against his lamppost, cane in hand, smiling into the storm. And then he saw his mother, the same image that had come to him in his dream, her face serene, her voice echoing faintly through the air. Every flame is a story, Elias, and you, my son, are its teller. The tears came without sorrow. They were warm, streaking down his frozen cheeks, melting the frost on his lashes. He whispered into the vast silence, "Then I will tell it, again and again, until my last breath." The wind rose briefly, whirling around him, lifting snow in gentle spirals. The flame in his lantern bent and flared, strong and brilliant. When the wind faded, the reflections beneath the ice dimmed, their light settling into a calm, steady glow. The air was still again. The message had been given. Elias crossed the remainder of the lake without fear. The ice sang softly beneath his boots, a sound like glass touched by wind. On the far shore, the land began to rise again into gentle slopes dusted with pine. The sun had begun to set, casting the world in soft amber light. He turned once, looking back. The frozen lake behind him gleamed with countless points of light, like a mirror to the stars above. He raised his lantern high. Its glow joined those reflections, merging with them until it seemed there was no boundary between earth and sky, light and memory. Then, with a deep breath, Elias whispered to the world behind him, "May every flame find its keeper." And the wind answered, faint, like a song sung from miles away. And every keeper, their light. The land beyond the frozen lake sloped gently downward into a quiet hollow where twilight gathered like smoke. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving behind streaks of rose and violet that slowly faded into the blue-gray of evening. Elias walked through that shifting light, his lantern swaying at his side, its golden glow the only warmth in the growing dusk. He had been walking for hours, but the air here felt softer, almost tender. The wind had stilled completely. Even the snow beneath his boots seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. The scent of pine gave way to something sweeter, smoke mixed with the faint aroma of baked bread. It reminded him of Harrows Hollow, of laughter carried through the streets on winter nights. And then he saw it, a small village nestled at the base of a hill, its rooftops glinting faintly under the rising stars. Unlike Harrows Hollow, there were no lamps burning along its roads. The windows were dark, the chimneys cold. The whole place looked like it had fallen asleep and never woken. Elias slowed his steps as he approached. The snow here lay thick and unbroken, no footprints, no tracks from sleds or horses. It was as though the village had been forgotten by time. He crossed the narrow bridge that spanned a frozen brook, its wooden railings heavy with ice. The sound of his boots against the boards echoed faintly in the stillness. Ahead, a church steeple rose above the rooftops, leaning slightly to one side, its bell long silent. At the first house, Elias knocked gently on the door. No answer. He tried another, then another. The wood beneath his gloves was cold and unyielding, the shutters drawn tight. But when he pressed his ear to one door, he heard something faint, a cough, the rustle of movement, a whisper. he spoke softly through the wood. "It's safe now. The storm has passed." Silence. Then a quiet, trembling voice. "Who's there?" "My name is Elias," he said. "A traveler. I bring light." The latch turned hesitantly. The door opened just a crack, revealing an elderly man with hollow eyes and a blanket drawn around his shoulders. The dim interior behind him smelled of soot and stale air. "Light?" the man repeated weakly. "There's none left here, traveler. Our oil ran dry 2 nights ago." Elias lifted his lantern, the flame shining between them. The old man blinked, tears springing to his eyes. "By heaven," he whispered, "you've kept it burning." "I have," Elias said gently. "And so can you." He stepped inside. The small house was cold and dark, the hearth long dead, frost creeping along the windows. A woman sat beside the empty fireplace, her hands clasped in prayer. When she saw Elias, she gasped softly, covering her mouth. He knelt beside the hearth and opened his satchel. Inside were the last 2 tins of oil, wrapped carefully in cloth. He poured one into the old iron lamp that hung from a nail in the beam, then touched his lantern's flame to its wick. The light bloomed slowly, golden and tender, filling the small room with warmth. The woman began to cry. The old man sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking. "Don't thank me," Elias said quietly. "Just keep it alive." He moved from house to house, lighting each lamp, each candle, each lantern that had waited in darkness. Doors opened as he passed. Faces emerged from shadow, children blinking against the sudden glow, elders whispering prayers of gratitude, mothers holding infants close as the warmth returned. By the time he reached the square, the whole village glowed softly beneath the stars. The snow reflected the lamplight, turning the streets into ribbons of gold, winding between white rooftops. The leaning church at the top of the hill caught the glow too, and for the first time in years, its stained glass windows shimmered faintly with color. Elias climbed the steps to the church door and pushed it open. Inside, the air was still and cold, the pews coated with a thin layer of frost. But on the altar stood an old candle, half melted, its wick blackened with soot. He smiled faintly. "You've waited long enough," he said. He struck a match and lit it. The candle flared, a single point of warmth in the dark sanctuary. Its light caught the dust in the air, making it sparkle like tiny stars. Elias sank onto one of the benches and set his lantern beside him. Outside, the bells began to move in the wind, creaking faintly. Then, with a deep, resonant note, one of them rang. The sound rolled down the hill and through the valley, waking the world. Villagers stopped in the streets, looking up. One by one, they turned toward the church and listened as the bell tolled again, slow, solemn, beautiful. The sound carried far beyond the village, echoing into the woods and over the frozen lake, where it mingled with the memory of lights still reflected in the ice. Elias closed his eyes. The sound filled his chest like breath, deep and steady. He thought of Harrows Hollow, of Miriam's candle, of Clara's small hands passing him her lantern. And he realized, with quiet certainty, that this sound, the voice of the bell, the echo of flame, was what he had been walking toward all along. The church glowed softly behind him as he stood and stepped once more into the cold. The village, now bright and awake, watched him in silence. No one called out or tried to stop him. They understood. The keeper of light never stayed. He only passed through, kindling what had been forgotten. Elias lifted his lantern and began walking toward the next hill, the stars guiding his way. Behind him, the bell rang once more, its sound fading slowly into the endless, listening night. The sound of the bell faded behind Elias as he walked, swallowed by distance and the hush of snow. Yet even as its echo dwindled, he could still feel it vibrating through the air. Not as noise, but as a pulse, a rhythm that seemed to align with the beating of his heart. It was as though the world itself had taken up the song of the lamps, carrying it forward into the silence. The night had deepened again, but it was no longer dark. A faint, silvery light poured from the half-moon above, washing the landscape in quiet grace. Snow blanketed the ground like silk, unbroken and clean. The hills rose and fell in soft waves, each one crowned with frost-bright pines that glittered faintly beneath the stars. Elias's lantern burned steadily as he followed the winding road. Its golden glow moved gently with his steps, lighting the path ahead, and behind him a faint trail of footprints stretched away into the distance, the only mark left on a world reborn from snow. He was not lonely, though no other soul walked beside him. The memory of those he'd met, Clara with her red mittens, Thomas with his cane, Miriam with her candle, Father Alcott's calm eyes, all walked quietly with him now, their voices resting like embers in the corners of his mind. At the crest of the next hill, he stopped. There, in the valley below, he saw what looked like a long line of broken stones, half buried in the snow. As he descended, he realized they were old mile markers, their carvings worn smooth by centuries of wind and frost. Between them ran a narrow road of cobblestone, ancient, nearly swallowed by the earth. And from somewhere far ahead, faint and fragile, came the sound of bells. Not church bells this time, smaller, lighter, their tones delicate and melancholy, carried on the wind like drifting threads of silver. Elias strained to listen. The pattern was irregular, almost human, as if the bells were being moved by hands rather than the air. He followed the sound. The path narrowed between two snowbanks, then opened into a small clearing surrounded by birches. In the center stood a wooden cart, half buried in snow. It was old, its wheels frozen in place, its surface blanketed with frost. From its frame hung dozens of tiny bells, each tied with a faded ribbon. As the wind passed through, they rang softly, 1,000 whispers of metal and memory. Elias approached slowly, his lantern light catching the bells, making them shimmer like stars. The air around the cart felt different, not cold but charged, like the stillness before a song begins. When he brushed snow from the side of the cart, he found an inscription carved faintly into the wood. For those who carried the light, and for those who will. He drew in a slow breath, his chest tight with emotion. These were memorial bells, tributes to the nameless travelers who had walked before him, keepers of light lost to time, but not to memory. He touched one of the ribbons gently. It was brittle with age, but still held the faint scent of smoke and pine. The bell it held rang once, pure and clear, and for an instant the air shimmered. A soft wind rose, weaving through the birches. The bells began to ring together, not in chaos, but in harmony, each tone finding its place in a melody that seemed to belong to the world itself. Elias closed his eyes and listened. The sound washed over him, a song without words but full of meaning. He saw in his mind flashes of the journey, the storm over Harrows Hollow, the flicker of candles in windows, the forest of whispering pines, the faces beneath the ice, the villages reborn in light. Every memory, every act of hope was there in the music of the bells. When the wind finally calmed, the last bell gave one lingering chime, and the clearing fell silent again. Elias opened his eyes, and the world seemed brighter somehow. Not by the lantern's glow, but by something deeper, as if the snow itself had learned to shine. He understood then what the road truly was. It wasn't just the path between villages or valleys. It was the road of those who keep the flame, an invisible line connecting every soul who has ever chosen to protect light from darkness. He bowed his head before the cart. "You carried it before me," he whispered, "and I'll carry it for those who come after." From the folds of his coat, he took out Clara's small lantern. Its light was faint now, the oil nearly gone. He hung it gently among the others. The flame flickered, dimmed, then steadied, joining the rest as though it had always belonged there. When it did, the smallest of the bells rang twice, clear as laughter. Elias smiled. "You've found your home." He stood there a while longer, listening to the last soft movements of air, before turning back to the path. His own lantern still burned strong, its light golden and alive. He took one final look at the cart and whispered, "Rest now, friends, I'll keep walking." The bells gave a single, approving note, and as he walked away, their echoes followed him for a long time, weaving through the night like a promise kept. Elias walked on through the deep blue night, guided by the faint rhythm of the bells fading behind him. The land began to change again, hills rising, then smoothing into flat, mist-draped meadows that glowed faintly under the moon. His boots sank softly into the snow with each step, leaving a trail that shimmered briefly before vanishing in the drifting fog. The mist was everywhere now, thick and slow-moving, curling through the air like breath. It muffled sound and softened the edges of the world until everything, sky, earth, horizon, blurred into one pale ocean of quiet. His lantern became the only fixed point in the vastness, a steady circle of warmth surrounded by endless grey. After a time, the ground beneath his feet changed from snow to wood. The hollow creak of his boots told him he had stepped onto a bridge, old, long and narrow, stretching into the fog. He could not see its far end. Below, faintly, he heard water moving, the slow, steady whisper of a river half frozen, but still alive. He stopped in the center, resting a gloved hand on the railing. Frost had formed delicate patterns there, spirals and stars, as if the night itself had left its signature. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and cedar. Elias lifted his lantern and peered into the mist ahead. There was no sound, no wind, only the rhythmic drip of melting ice falling into the dark water below. And then, faintly, he saw another light. It was small, so small he thought at first it was a trick of the fog, but it remained, hovering somewhere ahead, trembling like a candle seen through frosted glass. It burned a deeper gold than his, almost amber, warm and alive in the cold. He took a cautious step forward. The light didn't move away. Another step, and it seemed to draw closer, though he still could not see who or what carried it. "Hello?" he called softly. His voice barely carried, swallowed by mist. No reply. Only the faint ripple of water beneath the bridge. He walked on, his lantern raised high. The boards creaked softly beneath his boots, the sound echoing into the stillness. The other light flickered once, as though stirred by unseen breath, then steadied again. When he was close enough, he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the bridge, cloaked in grey wool, her hood drawn low over her face. Her hands were folded around a lantern, small, beautifully made, its glass etched with stars. The flame within glowed softly, casting light across the boards. Elias slowed his pace but did not stop. The mist curled around them both, and for a moment the bridge seemed suspended between two worlds, one of light, one of memory. "You've come far," she said finally. her voice soft as the fog itself. Elias nodded. Farther than I thought I could. Her head tilted slightly and he caught a glimpse of her face, young, though her eyes carried the weight of ages. And yet still you walk. The light isn't done, he said. A faint smile touched her lips. No, it never is. For a long moment they stood there, two lanterns burning in the mist, their lights mingling and weaving together. The air between them shimmered faintly, and Elias felt something stir within him, an echo of the forest voices, the whisper of the bells, the warmth of 1,000 unseen flames. The woman stepped closer. "You've carried it well," she said. "But every keeper must rest. The road is long and there are others waiting to walk it." Elias frowned.
Rest? She nodded. Not an ending, only a pause? You've kindled light in places where none dared burn it. Now it is time for the flame to travel without you. Her words fell like snow, soft, inevitable. He lowered his gaze to his lantern. The flame inside seemed to flicker brighter, as though aware of what was being asked of it. He felt an ache in his chest, not sorrow, but tenderness. The kind one feels when saying goodbye to something sacred. Elias stepped forward, holding the lantern between them.
"If it's to travel on," he said quietly, "then let it be through you." The woman extended her hands. When her fingers brushed his, they were warm, impossibly warm, like spring sunlight through glass. The flame leapt from his lantern to hers in a sudden, silent flash. For an instant, both lanterns burned together, his gold, hers amber, before his own went dark. He stood still, eyes closed, feeling the warmth fade from his palms. When he opened them again, her lantern glowed brighter than before, its light stretching through the fog until the whole bridge seemed to shimmer. She looked up at him, her expression serene. "You've done your part, Elias Wren. Rest now. The road remembers your steps." "How will I find my way without the light?" he asked softly. Her smile was calm, radiant. "You don't need to. The light will find you." And then, before his eyes, she began to fade, her outline dissolving into the mist, her lantern's glow scattering like fireflies across the air. Each spark drifted outward, vanishing one by one into the fog until only the faint glimmer of water remained below. Elias stood there for a long time, holding the now dark lantern in his hands. The silence was complete again, yet he felt no fear, no loss. The warmth remained within him, small, steady, unextinguished. When he finally looked up, the mist had thinned. The stars were visible again, reflected in the black surface of the river below. He whispered into the stillness, "Carry it well." And though the bridge was empty, he thought he heard a voice, gentle and familiar, whisper back, "Always." Elias turned toward the far shore. The sky was beginning to lighten there, just barely, the faintest breath of dawn touching the horizon. He began to walk again, the sound of his boots on the wooden boards like a heartbeat. The lantern in his hand was dark, but the world around him was already beginning to glow. The first faint blush of dawn crept across the world as Elias stepped off the bridge. The mist that had wrapped the night began to dissolve into ribbons of gold and pearl, revealing the sleeping hills beyond. Every surface, tree, stone, and drift of snow shimmered with frost that caught the morning light like dusted glass. For a long moment he simply stood there, breathing in the clean air. The river below murmured softly beneath its crust of ice, carrying with it the echoes of all that had come before, the bells, the voices, the songs. His lantern hung at his side, dark and cool now, its glass clouded from the cold. And yet, as the sunlight strengthened, he noticed something strange. Though the lantern held no flame, it glowed faintly, the metal reflecting not the sun itself, but something gentler, a warmth that seemed to come from within. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a whisper of light that refused to die. Elias smiled. "So you stayed," he murmured. The road ahead wound upward into low hills scattered with birch and juniper. The snow there was softer, the drifts shallow, the air tinged with the scent of thawing earth. The storm's dominion had ended. Life, quietly and without ceremony, was returning. He began to climb, the sun slowly rising behind him. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, and in the silence between his steps he heard the faintest birdsong, hesitant, like a voice relearning how to sing. At the top of the hill, the land opened into a wide plateau. From there, Elias could see miles in every direction, the frozen river winding like a silver thread, the black dots of distant forests, and, far to the west, the faint shimmer of the lamps of Harrows Hollow, barely visible even at this distance. They still burned. The sight struck him like a blessing. He felt the tightness in his chest ease, replaced by something vast and tender. "Still keeping watch," he whispered, almost laughing through the ache of it. He sat down on a stone at the hilltop, his back warmed by the first full light of morning. The sun crested the horizon, flooding the snow with a color too bright to name. Gold melted into rose, rose into white. The world breathed again. Elias took the small brass key from around his neck and turned it over in his palm. Its surface glowed in the sunrise, every scratch and dent catching the light. He thought of Thomas's weathered hand, pressing it into his own. "The light will wait," the old man had said. And it would. He set the key down on the stone beside him, then unwrapped the last gift he carried, the beeswax candle Miriam had given him back in Harrows Hollow. The wax had hardened in the cold, but when he held it up, he could see flecks of sunlight trapped inside, as though the candle had gathered its own tiny day. He placed it carefully beside the key, struck a match, and touched it to the wick. The flame rose, small but steady, its scent of honey faint but sweet. The light mingled with the sun's glow, trembling softly in the wind. He watched it for a long time, the golden wax dripping onto the cold stone. The candle seemed to hum quietly, alive in its own right. A final offering to all that had come before, and for the first time since the storm, Elias allowed himself to rest completely. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the warmth of morning wrapping around him like a blanket. He could still feel the pulse of the light within him, gentle, persistent, eternal. It no longer demanded to be carried, for it was everywhere now. In the river's shimmer, in the birds' hesitant song, in the lamps still burning miles away. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, he imagined the woman on the bridge still walking, her lantern lighting the path for others. Somewhere else, a child in red mittens might be placing a candle in a window just because it felt right to do so. The thought made him smile. The flame had never belonged to one person. It was the world's heartbeat, passed from hand to hand, century to century. He opened his eyes to the sun rising full and clear. The candle's flame bent toward the light as if in greeting, then steadied once more. Elias whispered, barely audible, "The lamps will burn all night, and all the nights to come." The wind stirred gently, carrying his words across the hills, over the river, and into the waiting valleys beyond. A promise renewed. And as the last breath of mist lifted, the road ahead shimmered faintly with a new warmth. invisible but sure. The keeper of the light had walked far, and the dawn walked with him. The sun had fully risen now, washing the snow-covered hills in warmth and gold. The wind moved softly through the birches, their slender branches glittering like strands of glass. Every sound, the whisper of air, the faint trickle of melting ice, the first brave notes of a bird calling from a distant pine, spoke of peace. And there, upon the hill, where the road met the sky, Elias Wren sat in the light. His lantern rested beside him, its metal warm again, its glass faintly glowing even without flame. The candle burned low next to the brass key, its last trail of smoke curling lazily upward into the bright air. He closed his eyes and breathed. Each breath came slower, deeper, lighter, as though the world itself had begun to breathe with him. He no longer felt the weight of the storm, nor the ache in his legs, nor the cold that had once sunk into his bones. There was only warmth now, soft, infinite, kind. He thought of Harrows Hollow, of the lamps that still burned in every window, of the church bell that had rung across the snow, of the laughter that had filled the square when light returned. He imagined the village waking to another morning, children running through the streets, their small hands lifted toward the lamps that had never gone dark. And beyond that, the valley he had left aglow, the woman who had taken the flame across the bridge of mist, the whispering forest where the pines sang his name, and the countless lights that would follow after. He smiled faintly, his voice no louder than the sigh of snow beneath the sun. It's all right now. The light will keep itself. The warmth deepened. The breeze stilled. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, not in mourning, but in reverence. Somewhere far away, a bell rang. Not the heavy, solemn kind that marks loss, but a single, bright note that trembled in the clear air like laughter. The flame of the beeswax candle fluttered once, then split into two. A tiny spark drifting up into the morning sky, carried by the wind. It rose higher and higher, catching the sunlight until it became indistinguishable from the day itself. And below, where Elias sat, the snow began to glow, not with fire, but with memory. A soft, golden shimmer spread through the ground, across the stones, into the fields, and beyond the horizon. The world, once frozen, had remembered how to shine. There would be other winters, other storms, other nights of fear and silence. But there would also be light, because somewhere, someone would always choose to keep it burning. Tonight, as you lie beneath your own quiet sky, perhaps you can see it too. That same small flame, flickering somewhere out there in the dark. It may live in the candle by your bedside, in the glow of a window down the street, or in the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. The story of Christmas, 1892, the winter, the lamps burned all night, is not only about one man's journey, but about all of us. About what we guard when the cold comes and how we share it when the dawn returns. So, wherever you are, in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in the quiet corners of the world, may your night be calm, your room be warm, and your heart carry that gentle light forward. If this story kept you company tonight, I'd be honored if you left a little light of your own below. A comment, a thought, perhaps just where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there. And before sleep takes you, remember, no darkness is ever complete so long as one lamp still burns. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be warm, and may your lamps burn gently all through the night.